woman in a little English village walking her dog. These were circumstances which people would think were nightmarish.
It broke a family. It caused the most horrendous shockwaves to a community.
You could sense that a village like this wasn't used to crime of that degree.
There was no possibility that he could be tried again for that offence.
I think it gave him this powerful energy that he used to terrorise people. His behaviour was vile.
This was a historic ruling in terms of double jeopardy.
It was legally groundbreaking.
It was high stakes. This was the first in the country.
He clearly thought he'd effectively got away with it.
Ascot under Wychwood, a pretty picture postcard village that's home to just 500 residents. This peaceful, rural parish lies in the Evenlode Valley in Oxfordshire.
Ascot under Wychwood is a small village. Lots of villagers will have been here for many, many years. There will be families that have had descendants that have grown up in the village, and people know each other, that people look out for one another. It really is a tight-knit community where people generally know what's going on.
You know, if you drove through a village, you'd say, oh, this is a really nice place to live, you know, very idyllic, nice people, and a place where you perhaps also feel quite safe.
In this idyllic Oxfordshire village lives mum of two, Vicky Thompson.
Vicky was an absolutely delightful mum, wife, and, you know, loved her family, great family unit. People that came into contact with her, you know, equally found her delightful. You know, she was a lovely, kind lady.
Vicky was a key part of the village community, as many people were. People would have known her in the village, and clearly living a nice, quiet life in the Oxfordshire countryside.
She's often seen out walking her beloved dog, Daisy.
She loved the fact that she could just, you know, come out of her front door and within moments she'd be surrounded by fields, you know, with a dog and the children. So, you know, for her, I think it was a perfect place for her to bring up her family.
But Vicky's perfect idyll is about to change. Vicky had just celebrated her 9th wedding anniversary with her husband in the village pub where she worked. So on the Saturday, they take it easy, relaxing in the garden.
It was a pleasant day, the weather was beautiful, so it was a typical, you know, idyllic weekend, really, that, you know, that's what families sort of strive for.
In the afternoon, Vicky decides to take collie Daisy out for a walk.
It would have been about 3:45, 4 o'clock when she set off at a regular time down the same country lane, across a little bridge over the river that ran through the village, to walk Daisy down to Shipton Lane, it was called, and to come back.
It's typical of a village lane in this sort of area, perfect for walking the dog, and I'd imagine it was a well-worn route for Vicky and many other dog walkers in the area.
But today, Vicky's dog Daisy does something quite unexpected.
The first that anyone was aware that something was wrong was when Daisy came back.
And then, unfortunately, when the dog returned without her, that's when alarm bells started to ring.
As time goes by, with no news from Vicky, concern starts to set in.
Vicky's husband went out, started looking, spoke to neighbours, spoke to friends, and then, you know, you almost naturally go into a sort of second phase of now starting to do a bit of a search, which is exactly what happened. So it sort of morphed into more of a search and thinking something's not quite right.
Vicky's husband assembles a small search team of family, friends and neighbours. They retrace her steps on her regular walk down Shipton Lane in the desperate hope of finding her.
One of those who were looking for her did notice some bloodstains on the surface of the path, but they thought that they were the blood of a sheep or something of that kind. They didn't think much of it at that time, so they went back to the village, and it was only when she still didn't return and they went back again that they looked at the bloodstain more carefully and came to realise that it was quite fresh, that beneath the congealed surface it seemed still to be wet. But much more importantly, nearby they then found some broken pieces of jewellery which were very quickly identified as hers. And that then became a source of real alarm, and I think it was that discovery which prompted the first call to the police.
Finding that jewellery, all that did was, I think, heighten the sense of nervousness within those that were looking for Vicky at the time.
As police make their way to the scene, the frantic hunt continues for Vicky. Her husband and neighbours are terrified she's clearly come to some harm. They make their way further down the lane.
This is Shipton Lane. We've got the lane itself, and then to the right you can see the train track, and they must have really panicked and must have been desperate in time to find her, and it wouldn't have taken them too long once they'd realised that she was no longer on the path to scour the local area.
3 hours after Vicky went missing, they spot something sinister.
They noticed a gap in the hedge that ran alongside the lane where the bloodstaining and the jewellery had been found. And when they went over to the gap, which led into a nearby agricultural field that was bordered by the embankment of the railway line, they could see something in the distance that looked out of place, and they made their way across the field.
And they would have found her in a bad way here.
To their horror, Vicky's lying on the ground, with blood covering her face and head. When her husband tries to speak to her, she's drifting in and out of consciousness.
She was clearly in a very bad way. He spoke of her mumbling, and he tried to keep her talking and tried to keep her coherent. I believe she could name the name of their son.
Something ominous close by suggests this is foul play.
There was a stone there nearby. She'd obviously been attacked. She was bleeding, and to discover her like that is quite a harrowing experience, really. But Vicky was found, and she was found alive.
Her husband asked her, "Who did this to you?" But he just couldn't quite make out what she was saying. She was clearly in a very bad way and clearly very seriously injured.
She was certainly not able to say what had happened, still less to identify who was responsible.
With Vicky's life hanging in the balance, an air ambulance is sent in response to airlift her from the scene.
Time was of the essence to call in an air ambulance. That must have meant that she was clearly very gravely injured. And so she was airlifted to hospital.
She's flown straight to Oxford's John Radcliffe Hospital, which specialises in treating brain injuries.
She'd suffered multiple blows with a hard object to her head, which had caused skull fractures and serious brain damage.
As police secure the crime scene, their minds turn to the violent attacker on the loose.
Had Vicky been in a position to talk, there is no doubt that she'd have said exactly who'd attacked her, because of course everyone knew everybody. Sadly, she wasn't able to do that.
With no immediate suspect in the frame, the fear of an attacker living in their tight-knit community is the talk of the village.
People think that it could have been them, that it seemingly there's no targeting, that perhaps this was just a random attack on any dog walker. It could have been them. And I think that probably did strike home to the local community and perhaps the wider community in the county and beyond.
Within the community, there's no doubt that it was colossal. You know, that fear of crime can be just as powerful. And when you've got a small community that has been completely rocked by what unfolded, there's no doubt that it impacted that community severely.
Over the next 6 days in intensive care, Vicky Thompson fights for her life.
Her condition quite quickly deteriorated, and she died a few days later. And the cause of her death was blunt force head injury.
It's the news no one in the quiet village of Ascot under Wychwood wants to hear. Vicky's violent assault has now become murder.
As a reporter, I've covered many incidences of dog walkers being attacked, and they strike a chord with people. But when it develops into a murder, then I think it really does chill people locally.
In the quiet Oxfordshire village of Ascot under Wychwood, mum of two, Vicky Thompson, has been brutally attacked whilst out walking the dog, and dies 6 days later from her injuries. With Vicky's violent killer still at large, her community and the wider public are in shock.
The profile of the case, of course, was substantially enhanced by where it took place, because this was a late summer's afternoon, a woman in a little English village walking her dog. These were circumstances which, upon reading them, people would think were nightmarish. This was not something that was supposed to happen. And I think for that combination of reasons, it very quickly attracted a great deal of publicity.
So the pressure's on for Thames Valley Police to track down Vicky's brutal attacker.
This is the area where the incident occurred, and it is typical of an Oxfordshire village. We're on the edge of the Cotswolds, and it is a lane. You can clearly see why it was popular with dog walkers. It's the kind of lane, it's quite overgrown. It's the kind of area that someone who didn't want to be seen could perhaps sort of conceal themselves and look as people walked along. We've got the railway line to my right here, the embankment, which is where Vicky was found.
Since the assault, police have been sweeping the area, looking for clues that could lead to the killer.
Looking at the lane, looking at the jewellery that was found, it was a view that perhaps where she was found wasn't necessarily where she was ultimately attacked at the time.
Scenes of crime officers retrace the killer's steps, back to the bloodstains on the path where they believe the attack happened.
As with all crime scenes, that becomes the most fundamental starting point of your investigation. Because what's left behind is what you need to try and secure.
At the attack scene, clumps of blood-stained hair are found on nearby rocks.
Vicky was clearly struck about the head with a blunt instrument, potentially a rock or a stone, and clearly suffered very serious head injuries. It then appears that she was moved somehow, perhaps dragged over towards the railway line.
Although the attack happened in broad daylight, investigators have got their work cut out finding any witnesses.
This is the Cotswold line. It is a pretty quiet line. There isn't a main line. There won't be too many trains coming past at any time of day. And so no one would have really witnessed it. There wouldn't be too much passing traffic.
Police are also trying to work out why Vicky was dumped by the railway line.
Potentially moving Vicky's body or moving her unconscious body towards the embankment might have concealed what had happened, that potentially it might have been made to look like an accident, but there was no real motive put forward for why she was moved closer towards this railway embankment.
But 200 metres from the scene of the attack, officers make an intriguing find.
In a hedge was found a plastic bag which contained 2 items of ladies' underwear that were discovered to have been contaminated with semen. This was obviously a hugely significant find, both because of what it was and because of where it took place.
Although the underwear does not belong to Vicky, it's sent off to the lab for DNA analysis. Meanwhile, police continue the hunt for potential witnesses to the attack. 2,500 people would eventually be interviewed in the surrounding area.
A huge amount of work was done. House to house was done, lots of statements taken. Because unless you start to build up a picture, you can only do that by engaging with the community. And so it was a significant, large investigation, treated as a serious investigation right from the very outset.
But in the village, one name starts coming up on the doorstep. 20-year-old odd job man, Mark Weston.
And there's those that, are mischievous and those that are perhaps, trouble. Mark Weston was trouble, not mischievous, he was trouble. And the investigation identified Mark Weston as a key suspect, and they had every reason to do so.
And police are told Weston is often seen on the path leading towards the crime scene, Shipton Lane.
He used to go down there. This is a chap, we've got to bear in mind, he didn't have a day job. He hanged around. So this place was a sort of regular haunt. There was lots of witnesses that would place him on this lane because it was a regular thing for him to do.
Through door-to-door inquiries, 4 separate villagers tell police they saw Weston heading towards Shipton Lane just before the approximate time of Vicky's attack. The local post office clerk claims she saw him looking alarmed, covered in sweat, and running away from the village only an hour later.
Some witnesses had come forward and said that they'd seen him acting strangely. It became very clear, as a result of, the inquiries that went on, that Weston became a suspect.
So police pay a visit to Mark Weston. On the morning of the murder, he claims he went fishing and shopping, but was at home all afternoon during the time of the attack. 3 days later, when police question him again, his story changes, and he says he was at home all day. 5 days later, it's a different story. Weston claims he actually left his house at 5 p.m, not long after the attack, to call on his neighbours who weren't in. But Weston's neighbours beg to differ. They say they had been at home at the time Weston said he'd visited and had never seen him. For police, something doesn't stack up.
There are conflicting reports about where he was. All this sort of stuff was coming in that conflicted with what Mark was saying. It would be right to look at him very carefully. But looking very carefully is one thing. Having the evidence to support an arrest is another.
But when scenes of crime officers search his garden 4 weeks after the murder, they find the charred remains of a sweatshirt or jacket that he's attempted to burn.
As the investigation went on, other evidence started becoming apparent about, the burning of clothes. And so there's a few things that led the investigation to Mark Weston.
Today, police have arrested a 20-year-old man in the investigation into the murder of Vicky Thompson.
As the evidence builds, Mark Weston is arrested and taken in for questioning. He maintains his story, that he was at home at the time of Vicky's attack. Meanwhile, police search his house, seizing some of his clothing, including a pair of his boots. They are sent off for forensic analysis. The results come back to the senior investigating officer.
The SIO at the time asked the question, was there blood on this boot? The answer came back, no. You can't do any more with that. The question's been asked, and the answer was given.
Weston is released, and the police continue their inquiries. But soon, the lab has more news, and this time it could turn the case on its head. The lady's underwear found near the crime scene has a DNA result for the body fluids found on them. It matches Mark Weston.
That became a key piece of evidence. It linked Mark Weston to the scene, no question at all.
In Ascot-under-Wychwood, Oxfordshire, police have a prime suspect for the murder of mother of two, Vicky Thompson. DNA linked to Mark Weston is found in a bag of ladies' underwear close to the attack scene. With this new key evidence, police now believe they've established a motive.
He quite possibly was seen by Vicky performing a sex act and perhaps reacted angrily to Vicky, perhaps accosting him and asking him what's going on, and then things escalated from there.
I mean, would he really want the village to be aware that he was behaving like that, which was perverse activity?
I think he was threatened with humiliation and possibly worse. And I think the initial violence that he used was in temper and spontaneous. Once things start to go wrong, they get worse. And I'm afraid I think that's what happened here.
As Weston is put under the spotlight, more evidence is uncovered, linking to the bag of underwear found near the attack scene.
During a search of a narrow watercourse that ran down the back of the gardens of the houses in the street where he lived was another plastic bag in which were found other items of ladies' underwear which had been placed there or an attempt had been made to conceal them after the day of the attack. He did not want items of ladies' underwear to be found in his home which would connect him to the scene, and so he had separately disposed of those so as to prevent that connection from being made.
Although none of this underwear belongs to murder victim Vicky, police can now see Weston's trying to hide a sordid secret.
It was the underwear of women who lived in the village, and it had been taken from their washing lines, and he was using it for a sexual purpose. His reputation in the village from that day onwards would have been destroyed. I think there would have been an element of ridicule in it for him, and it might well be that he just couldn't bear the thought of that.
It seemed from the evidence that Mark Weston perhaps had a troubling relationship with women and perhaps fixated on some women locally. We will never know.
Today, a 20-year-old man has been charged with the murder of Vicky Thompson.
6 months after Vicky Thompson's brutal killing, Mark Weston is charged with her murder. Then, in November that same year, he finally faces trial at Oxford Crown Court. But before the case barely gets underway, the prosecution's dealt a serious blow.
I think the police and perhaps the Thompson family felt very aggrieved that the judge presiding over the trial ruled inadmissible some key evidence, and that was that bag found with 2 pieces of underwear containing DNA from Weston very near the scene. That was ruled inadmissible. The jury couldn't know about that.
With little other evidence proving Weston's inappropriate sexual behaviour, the judge believes this one piece of proof could unfairly sway the case.
The judge felt it just wasn't fair for Weston that he would get a fair trial if that was admitted. And I've got no doubt having that judge make that direction would have been hard to be accepted. But the law is there to protect everybody, whether you're a victim or an offender, to make sure, from an offender's perspective, that you get a fair trial.
But police have now lost their vital evidence linking Weston to the crime scene.
And so a key bit of evidence, a key bit of fact-finding from the police was ruled out at a stroke.
It is unfortunate that that wasn't admitted as evidence. It would have been crucial. It would have significantly helped the Crown's case.
As the trial continues, the prosecution case never recovers.
There have always been discrepancies and inconsistencies in the accounts which he gave at the time about his movements, but none of that was sufficient to prove an opportunity for him to have been where she was in order for him to have carried out the attack. And in the absence of a piece of evidence which could clearly establish that, it was always going to be difficult.
Following a trial lasting 14 days, the jury retires to consider the case. To the court's surprise, they return in just 50 minutes. The verdict? Mark Weston is not guilty. It's a body blow for the police and Vicky's family.
An acquittal in 50 minutes or so is fairly rare in my experience, and so clearly the jury in that original trial just didn't feel there was the evidence there to convict Mark Weston.
An acquittal so quickly after retirement was interpreted as a declaration of innocence, a statement by the jury, not merely that it hadn't been proved that it was him, but that it very definitely wasn't him.
It is very disappointing when a jury does come back and return a verdict of not guilty, when you know and you strongly believe that that person is guilty.
The case was thrown out very quickly, and so the police and Thompson's family and friends clearly walked away from the Crown Court that day very disappointed indeed.
They made their decision at the time that had to be accepted.
Mark Weston even appears on local news to boast about his acquittal.
Cleared of murder, Mark Weston is this morning back with his family.
Well, I've done nothing wrong, but they still kept saying it was me, though it wasn't. But now they've come to realise they had the wrong person.
And to add salt to their wounds, Thames Valley Police comes under fire from the unlikeliest of places.
Following the acquittal, one of the jurors felt sufficiently strong about what they had observed during those proceedings to write directly to Mr. Weston, suggesting that he might sue the Thames Valley Police for a wrongful prosecution.
Although Weston secures legal aid to do this, his case runs out of steam. So he turns to other ideas of how to seek revenge.
There's a thought that you might quietly just go back and just be perhaps under the radar. Weston was none of that. When he got acquitted, I think he had a sense of empowerment.
He acted with impunity after that. He moved back into the community. And he taunted the community, perhaps in some ways, and literally harassed people who'd been involved in that original trial. He didn't try to fade away.
Barely a year later, Weston launches a campaign of harassment against the village bobby who helped investigate the case. Day and night, he makes up to 50 silent phone calls to the PC, his wife and their 2 daughters.
He terrorised the officer. And bearing in mind, that's how we policed. You know, we're in that community, we're part of the community, because you are a member of the village. And I've been there, and it's lovely. But the thought of them being terrorised is just harrowing.
After police put video surveillance on the village phone box and record Weston's phone calls, he's convicted for harassment. Weston is sentenced to a 2-year conditional discharge and a restraining order. So next, Weston moves on to another villager who also provided evidence in his murder case.
I believe he put some posters up around the village, and he made remarks about people being a grass, and clearly he went on the offensive.
Weston shines lights into his neighbour's house and posts threatening notes through her door. Mark Weston is convicted of harassment once again. He's sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
This empowerment, I think, overwhelmed him. So he became very vexatious. I am permitted to do this because actually I've been acquitted. I think it gave him this powerful energy that he used to terrorise people. His behaviour was vile.
He was perhaps a little bit arrogant. He didn't feel that he was under any threat from being hauled back to court. The law at the time meant that he couldn't be retried for the same offence, and so he clearly thought he'd effectively got away with it.
But a change of law on the horizon would soon give the investigators new hope.
Why? Because we knew, without question, that Mark Weston killed Vicky.
Ascot under Wychwood, Oxfordshire. In spite of proof linking Mark Weston to the murder of villager Vicky Thompson, he's acquitted in court. And the so-called double jeopardy law means Weston will never face justice again, even if new evidence comes to light.
It was a horrific attack, and her family must have been deeply troubled by no one having been convicted of her murder.
But in 2003, there's fresh hope.
Parliament passed an act which abolished the common law rule of double jeopardy, permitting, in limited circumstances, the prosecution for a second time of the same individual for the same offence.
2 years later, on the 10th anniversary of Vicky's tragic murder, Thames Valley Police's cold case review team reopens the investigation, with then Detective Superintendent Barry Halliday leading the unit.
That was typically one of the cases that was immediately identified as needing to be reviewed.
That didn't mean it was easy for prosecutors to bring another case. It was, in fact, there was a very high bar for the prosecution to succeed. They'd also need compelling, fresh, new evidence. They knew that a murderer had walked free after that initial trial, and they just needed that one piece of evidence to get him, to nail him, to get their man.
The light bulb moment for investigators comes from another high-profile case that hit the headlines 5 years earlier. The murder of Peckham schoolboy, Damilola Taylor.
The senior police officer was attending a lecture, and how, upon the first investigation of the death of that little boy, highly incriminating bloodstains had not been detected upon items of clothing being examined by scientists during the investigation, and how difficult it is sometimes to find them.
So detectives try and hunt down any of Weston's belongings that weren't returned to him following the first investigation. They're in luck. Weston's boots are found in one of the Force's exhibit stores. Could they contain that golden nugget of proof police desperately need?
There was no harm in sending those boots back in. Fresh pair of eyes, fresh forensic opportunities, and testing and examination, and just be sure that there was no forensics on those boots.
In the 10 years since the boots last saw the light of day, forensic techniques have massively evolved.
The changes in procedures for searching for blood would involve a change in the sorts of lights that we regularly use. We now use a fibre optic lamp, and that has a halogen bulb in it. Previously, people just used perhaps an overbench light with a tungsten bulb in it. And we know that that change in lighting is much better for looking for bloodstains. The other change is that we will more regularly use a low-power microscope to search an item for blood, whereas previously that wasn't routinely used.
So scientists put Mark Weston's boots under the microscope to see if the tiniest spot of blood had been missed the first time round. The fact that they are black proves to be the greatest challenge.
People think of bloodstains as being bright red. Well, they are when they're fresh, but they very quickly change their appearance. They darken.
The blood doesn't show up readily on a black surface. There are also lots of nooks and crannies, and it has a very intricate surface, so it's a difficult item to examine, and I think even a careful and diligent scientist could miss blood if they weren't examining it under optimum conditions.
But soon, forensic scientists hit the jackpot.
We found some blood staining on Mark Weston's boots, and DNA profiles were obtained from that blood, and those matched Vicky Thompson. That was really the significant moment in this case. It was the turning point.
It's the news the cold case team have been longing for.
The case was never closed. And to get a moment like that where you're told that all that hard work that your team has ploughed into and actually you get fundamental evidence is euphoric.
They'd finally found that smoking gun, that real piece of evidence that they needed to seal the conviction that they thought they should have sealed years earlier.
After 4 years spent rebuilding their case, police swoop in to rearrest Mark Weston.
He was absolutely, frankly furious. You know, he was adamant, arrogant, can't believe this is happening to me again. You know, that sort of behaviour. So all the evidence was presented to him, including the overwhelming evidence of the blood of Vicky on his own boots. Absolutely no response from him at all, accepting any responsibility or liability for Vicky's death. A complete and utter denial.
But the police aren't home and dry with a prosecution yet. Next, they have to convince a court of appeal. And these are uncharted waters. It's one of the first times a double jeopardy case has been heard before the court.
Our case was made very strongly, and then there is that huge sense of nervousness whilst you're waiting for the decision.
After weeks of waiting, police and prosecutors finally get news.
Given how compelling the evidence was, the Court of Appeal made the decision that it was in the interests of justice for Mr. Weston to be tried again, and his acquittal was quashed.
That was agonising, waiting. But the news came back. You are elated.
It was a great moment when we heard that the Court of Appeal had overturned the acquittal. This was a historic ruling in terms of double jeopardy and introducing new scientific evidence.
5 months later, Weston finally hears the murder case against him for a second time.
There was a real sense that Thames Valley Police had been given a second chance here, and so there was a sense of tension that the police were gambling in a sense, that this was their final throw of the dice.
It was high stakes. The tension was immense, and Weston continued to be as arrogant as ever.
But this time, the discovery of underwear near the crime scene linked to Weston is allowed to be heard in court. It's clear even he can't explain away the overwhelming evidence against him.
There wasn't going to be much anybody could do about the fact that her blood was found on his boots. The scientific evidence this time round was simply unanswerable.
Perhaps he knew that his time was finally up, and that last piece of evidence was crucial, and he couldn't fight this any longer.
But Weston's fate is once again in the hands of the jury as they retire to consider their verdict.
The trial was absolutely extremely intense. That wait was probably the most sensitive, nervous time I've ever experienced.
The jury delivers their verdict. Mark Weston is finally found guilty of Vicky Thompson's murder. 15 years after her death, the judge jails him for a minimum of 13 years.
This arrogant man, this man who'd sort of taunted those who tried to bring him to justice, was finally behind bars.
It's a relief to the husband who comforted his dying wife after Weston's vicious attack.
It doesn't bring back his wife, and nothing can, of course, but it was the verdict they wanted.
It was big, it was significant, but let's not lose sight of the real fact here. The real fact here is Vicky lost her life. She shouldn't have done. It broke a family. It caused the most horrendous shockwaves to a community. And this individual evaded capture for all those years.
And the case will forever be etched in the memory of the quiet Oxfordshire village of Ascot under Wychwood.
It was clearly a case that had a big impact locally, and perhaps continues to do. People haven't forgotten what's happened, and so that case does still live long in the memory locally.
And what of Mark Weston himself?
There's no remorse, there's no acceptance. This was a miscarriage of justice. Well, that was rich. The miscarriage of justice occurred years ago. Weston committed that murder, and Vicky's life was taken away by that monster, nobody else.
Gripping from the get-go, witnessing a murder is just the tip of the iceberg. The mob offers a way out and a tough decision in The Cleaning Lady, available now on Sky Witness with a new episode every Monday.
Emergency.
I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. Please, can you send someone quickly?
Yeah, I am.
Police have launched a murder investigation after a woman was found dead at her home in Middlesbrough.
I was absolutely terrified, thinking, what if somebody got in my house?
It felt like there was a serial killer at large and you wondered if they were going to do it again.
When a successful pharmacist is found murdered, her devastated husband goes into shock.
No, Jess, come on, baby, wake up. Baby, wake up.
And a community is torn apart.
You wouldn't believe, obviously, what we went through and the level of betrayal there. It was a shock.
In the northeast of England lies one of Middlesbrough's most attractive areas, Linthorpe.
It's quite an affluent area. Big houses, quite leafy, long driveways, nice cars on the drive, professional people live there.
You know, it's a family area, it's very friendly. Best part about it is the neighbours, you know, we all get on and good community. It's very safe, yeah. Very safe.
In the heart of the community were a couple named Jessica and Mitesh, who owned a pharmacy in the village.
We've got a chemist here actually on our doorstep. It's a husband and wife team, so they work together. The couple are really friendly people, helpful. Whatever you need, they're always there for you to help you out. You know, any advice that you need, they're always there.
Both Jessica and Mitesh were from large Hindu families in West Yorkshire.
We grew up in a joint family, so there was 12 of us in my household.
Jessica was the first child, a happy, calm child to what I remember. She was a good child, never any bother.
Very fond memories of growing up with Jess, because we were only probably about 18 months apart in age, so quite close together. She was always fun to be around, because she was always happy no matter what, always had a smile on her face.
Jessica had big plans for her future and went to study at Manchester University.
Jessica always said that she wanted to be a pharmacist. She always wanted to help people. That was her thing.
It was at university that Jessica met Mitesh, and the pair quickly struck up a relationship together.
I think Jessica's mum was ill around the time that they got together, and Mitesh was support for Jessica and would, you know, say all the right things, buy her presents, teddy bears, things like that.
He was constantly showering her with gifts. I think she must have had like 50 plus Me To You teddy bears in her collection, because we shared a room. They were like dotted all over the room. And she was just really happy. I got privy to a lot of their evening conversations at bedtime. Mitesh and Jessica would often be on the phone, and because we were sharing a room, it would be a case of her saying to him, "You put the phone down," and he'd be like, "No, you put the phone down."
They seemed just like a happy couple, well, a happy young uni couple.
Jessica's mother sadly passed away, but Mitesh helped her through this difficult time, and the couple soon mapped out their future together, despite some initial resistance.
Initially, when Jessica approached Dad about getting married, he wasn't so ecstatic about it. He didn't think they were a suitable match for Jessica, but Jessica persisted. She insisted that she loved him, and vice versa.
She wouldn't take a no. So, of course, obviously, in this day and age, we know that we can't force our child. And when she says that, "No, Dad, if I marry, it's him that I'm going to marry." But if that's the man she wants to marry, then that be it then.
In July 2009, the couple threw a big Indian wedding.
The marriage took place here in my garden. It was the first wedding within the Patel or the Hindu community that had 500 or 600 people.
Newly married, the couple set their sights on a fresh start and set up home among the village community of Linthorpe.
They got a lease on Roman Road Pharmacy and then bought a house on the avenue. A lovely big house which needed work doing, so they spent time renovating it and building up their pharmacy, you know, becoming well-known people in the community.
Having both a successful business and a new home in place, there was just one thing missing from their perfect life.
Jessica wanted to be a mother, She's always had a very motherly and a maternal instinct. Being the oldest sibling out of all 6 of us as well, she was always that much more maternal. And she wanted children of her own. I think it's something they'd thought about for years.
Apparently the couple struggled to fall pregnant, so started undergoing a course of IVF treatment, which I can only assume is a really grueling process, and that shows how much they must really wanted a child.
She expressed to me that it wasn't working naturally and that they were going to be starting IVF. All in all, Jessica went through 3 rounds of IVF that were unsuccessful. Each time she would ring me and she would say it didn't work, and she would be heartbroken that it hadn't worked, and I think the emotional distress of it all was just too much. She'd just come back off holiday and we were talking in the evening, and she was just telling me about the IVF and this 4th round. She was so happy because this round was a positive round. She said that it looks like it's going really well. They managed to freeze 3 embryos, and in June, so within a matter of weeks, she was due to have them implanted, and she was so positive they were going to work this time. The happiness was in her. I can't even describe how happy she was, because that dream of becoming a mother was just about to materialise for her.
But just weeks before Jessica's dream of motherhood could be realised, everything changed.
It's emergency.
I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. I've just come home and the house is ransacked and she's just on the floor. She's got duct tape all over her and she's like unconscious.
Right, you said is your wife breathing? Can you feel her pulse?
No, I can't feel anything. Her hands are really cold. She's got like blood on her nose and stuff dripping out onto the floor. Please, can you send someone quickly?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Okay, listen. The police are outside. Can you let the police officer in?
It's Jessica.
I'll leave her with you, okay?
Police and paramedics rush into the house and find Jessica in the living room. They try resuscitating her, but she is pronounced dead at the scene.
All we knew was that there'd been a murder. Her husband had came home from work and found her.
Has somebody broken into their home? And is it a burglary gone wrong? It was just utter shock that, anything like this could have happened.
In the picturesque village of Linthorpe, the community is waking up, reeling at news of a murder. But the previous morning, May 14th, started out like any other day in the Patel household.
Jessica and Mitesh had been in the pharmacy working. Jessica's dad popped into the pharmacy to speak to them both.
I can see that smile on the day I walked in, which would have been just after 10 o'clock. And I can still see her far back because it was a sort of a deep pharmacy. So I said, I'll be down next week. And she goes, OK, Dad, I'll see you next week. Of course, I did hug her. And I couldn't believe that I would never see her again.
Mitesh worked the early shift, leaving the pharmacy to spend the afternoon at the gym.
Jessica went home, Mitesh pops back to the pharmacy, goes to the local pizza shop to pick up a pizza for the pair of them, texts his wife to say he was getting the pizza, he'd be home shortly.
He came from the chemist roughly around about 7:30. He ordered his pizza and then he left. We were quite busy at the time, so it must have been about 20 minutes, half an hour. He'd come back. I gave him his pizza. I shook his hand like normal, and he left with the pizza.
Mitesh then goes home and makes the awful discovery.
It's emergency.
I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. I've just come home and the house is ransacked and she's just on the floor. She's got duct tape all over her and she's like unconscious. Her hands are really cold. Please, can you send someone quick?
Yeah, I am.
No, Jess, come on, baby, wake up. Baby, wake up.
Cleveland police respond immediately and preserve the crime scene.
We have in the investigation what we call the golden hour. The first hour is critical because the evidence is contained in the scene and it's nearby. You seal the scene totally and nobody, absolutely nobody, including the husband, go back indoors. Once that's happened, we'll talk to the witness and get the story of events.
News of the attack soon spreads.
I just came back from a friend's house. I couldn't get into the road. Loads of van police, 2 ambulances. It was like a movie, like something you'd see out of a movie. To be honest, it was absolutely horrendous.
Police have launched a murder investigation after a woman was found dead at her home in Middlesbrough. Officers were called to a house on the Avenue in Linthorpe at 8:20 on Monday evening. 34-year-old Jessica Patel, originally from the Leeds area, was found with serious injuries at an address in Linthorpe and was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives are appealing to anyone who may have seen...
I got a call from my younger sister and she just said to me that something's happened in Middlesbrough. So I asked her, I was like, you know, is everything okay? She says, I don't know, Dad's gone. We're just going to wait and see when Dad gets there what he says. So I said, okay, keep me updated. But when I woke up, I saw my husband sat at the end of our bed. I sort of sat up and I looked at him. And when I looked at him, I thought, something's not right. And he turned around to me and he just said to me, I've got no easy way to say this to you, but Jess passed away last night. I think those words in that instant hit me like a ton of bricks. My heart started racing a lot like it's racing now. Just thinking of that moment, I didn't want to believe him. That can't be true. You know, how could this just suddenly have happened? I remember calling Dad, and Dad's confirming that it was true. Something had happened. A burglar had got in, and Jessica had been harmed in the process, and that she'd been killed.
After receiving the devastating news, Jessica's family immediately rally round and make their way to the family home to support her husband, Mitesh.
I walked into their main living room where Mitesh was sat on the sofa, and I went straight over to him, sat down next to him, and he buried his head into my shoulder and was crying. I consoled him and just hugged him and told him that no matter what, we were there to support him. I myself was crying. The whole room, to be honest, was crying. Everyone was upset.
News of Jessica's murder sends shockwaves through the village.
I can't really know that. How can a murder happen in this beautiful place? It's a Linthorpe village area, everyone's friendly, and, you know, all of a sudden you actually hear like that she's been killed. And you think, you know, how can somebody do that, especially to a chemist, a pharmacist person who's actually, you know, there to help you.
How it happened to beautiful Jessica, you know, and she was so lovely, and you can't even imagine how someone can kill her. It's a fear. It's a lot. No words, really.
It felt like there was a serial killer at large, and you wondered if they were going to do it again.
With such a big story breaking in the close-knit village community, local journalist Felicity Collinson is hot on the case from the off.
I went out to the scene and the street was just like really quiet, you know. It was quite like an eerie quietness that morning. Cordon had now been moved to just around the house. It was just covering the driveway. There was forensics in white suits walking in and out of the house, carrying cases in and brown envelopes, evidence bags. There was CSI vans, uniformed police officers on guard. I started to knock on neighbours' doors to try and find out what had happened.
With Mitesh too distraught to speak, it was left to neighbours to speculate what had happened. Had someone targeted this young, successful couple out of jealousy?
A lot of people have been saying that there's been a burglary in the house.
Obviously, they look like a wealthy couple because they have quite a wealthy house, and obviously having the pharmacy and everything. Someone who knew them, possibly, had, took a chance to burgle them, maybe thought she had money, maybe jewellery, and that's where it was, and she was just in the wrong place, the wrong time.
We check our doors, even windows, and make sure, put alarm on, put everything on to go out, and we don't let our kids go.
I was absolutely terrified, thinking, what if somebody got in my house? What if that happened to me? I've got children. I was absolutely terrified.
Was it somebody who thought that the couple had money with them having the pharmacy? Did they have a safe in there where they kept the take-ins? Could somebody have broken in for that? Or was it somebody who needed or wanted drugs and believed that they may have kept drugs in the house? Or was it a big mistake that they'd got the wrong house?
While a grieving Mitesh stays with the family, police take a closer look at the crime scene. And one thing jumps out immediately. There's no sign of a forced entry. Meaning one thing, Jessica knew her attacker.
If there's no sign of forced entry, it looks like they've got in through an open door, which suggests that the victim would know them and allow them in. Everybody is a suspect till they're eliminated, without exception. So what we've now got to try and do is eliminate those who couldn't have been there at the time.
With no sign of a break-in, everyone known to Jessica is under suspicion. Could husband Mitesh offer clues as to who his wife may have let in the house?
The neighbour said she opens the door far too easily, far too quickly.
Neighbours saying about her being very nice, very trusting, too trusting, would allow anybody in the house without checking their identity. And therefore, we'd have to look at that, because if there's no forced entry, we will be worried about somebody who's just been let in the house. Does she have a relationship with another man or another person?
Police need to identify a timeline of events in order to pinpoint when the killer gained access to the house. So they turn to Mitesh for help.
You'll want to know where he was, what time he went, because the timeline, when he left and when he came home, is significant, because you need to be looking at perhaps other houses and CCTVs.
Mitesh explains to police that after going to the gym, he had gone out to get pizza at his usual takeaway, before returning home to discover his wife's body.
The husband of the victim seemed like he was a pleasant, kind of like quiet type of guy, wasn't he? He'd just do his work. He'd come, he'd order his food, go home like everybody else.
The pizza parlour's CCTV helps police create an exact timeline of the evening and when Jessica was left alone.
The police came in to the shop and kind of like asked for the camera footage of the husband of the victim, and basically kind of explained what was going on in a small way. They didn't really tell us exactly what was going on, but they just kind of gave us a clue to why they need, and what's happened.
He took my camera, CCTV camera, he took it from here. He said, I want to see what's going to happen in here, like when he came, when he go out, that's it.
With Mitesh's movements that evening clear, police are still no closer to establishing who had gained access to their home. But post-mortem results help police identify the cause of death. Could this lead to clues as to her attacker?
It's found that she died from pressure to her neck. There was also a suggestion that, from marks to Jessica's neck, that a ligature of some sort had been used.
And in asphyxiation, of course, you've got to look at was something placed over a mouth, over a nose, was there some other way of stopping the oxygen getting to her? All those sorts of things you expect the examiner to tell you about.
Despite this crucial information, no murder weapon is found at the scene. 3 days into the investigation, and police are no closer to a motive or a suspect.
Police hadn't arrested anybody. I know personally I felt a bit of worry for the people living in that street. You know, I would have felt worried.
But on the 17th of May 2018, things take a dramatic turn.
A man has been arrested in connection with the murder of a woman in Middlesbrough.
Everyone's talking about it, that they've caught somebody.
When we find out who the police have arrested, it's just tragic, just a tragedy.
In the pretty village of Linthorpe, the close-knit community has been coming to terms with the murder of local pharmacist Jessica Patel. In the days since, Jessica's family rally around a grieving Mitesh.
On Thursday morning, we proceeded to Mitesh's house again, just to lend support. We spent the morning there, but then Dad received a call from the liaison officers asking us if we could return home because they needed to speak with us.
They didn't really tell me what it was for, but something related, which I thought they may want some more statements. We come home, we sat in that room, and there's the police, the family liaison officers, and they said, Mr. Patel, we have to tell you this. It's Mitesh. And we're arresting him. And I says, hang on, what did you say? And they repeated it, where I says, look, have you got it right? And they said yes. They assured me that it's him, and as we speak, we're arresting him.
Having just spent the morning comforting Mitesh, his arrest comes as a shock to Jessica's family.
You can't help but think that why would he do it? You know, what reason could he possibly have for having to murder Jessica? At the same time, you're like, have you got the right person? Because if you haven't, that person's getting away.
Yesterday afternoon, police arrested a 37-year-old man in the West Yorkshire police area on suspicion of murder following the death of 34-year-old Jessica Patel in Middlesbrough on Monday. The man remains in police custody.
News of Mitesh's arrest becomes public and locals react in horror. How could this loving husband and pillar of the community have anything to do with such a brutal killing?
It was a bit of a shock, to be honest with you, because we thought of them as, you know, good people, normal people. We didn't think anything was going on in their home.
We were all just so shocked, gobsmacked, really. We're still thinking, is this really a husband who's been, you know, arrested for her murder? You know, he's a pharmacist, she's a pharmacist. You just don't expect this at all.
So what had led to the arrest of Jessica's seemingly besotted husband? The man she'd been looking forward to starting a family with.
The police are still searching the house, you know, for evidence and clues. And then there's a breakthrough.
So Scenes of Crime officers find a hard drive wrapped in clothing underneath the mattress. It has a serial number on it which relates to the CCTV in the house.
When police had previously spoken to Mitesh, there had been no mention of this CCTV. Surely the first thing that you would do, or one of the first things you would do if your wife had been murdered, is think, oh, we've got CCTV. The footage of the killer will be on our CCTV. But there was no mention of this at all from Mitesh.
Police examined the CCTV footage from the hard drive.
It shows that it was switched off or taken or removed 6 minutes before he called the police for the 999 call.
Police rewind the footage to look for any clues earlier in the day. But what they find shocks them. The CCTV shows that at 3:30 p.m, Mitesh returned home from the gym, but never left to get pizza before Jessica came home from work at 7 p.m. Instead, Mitesh doesn't leave the house till 7:42 p.m. and then returns home with the pizza at 8:15 p.m. 4 minutes later, the camera is switched off.
This is a crucial piece of evidence because it doesn't show any other person entering or leaving the house other than Jessica and Mitesh. You know, there's no other, intruder or person sneaking around.
Mitesh calls police at 8:24 p.m. to report finding his wife dead. With no sign of anyone else coming to the house, police hone in on their now #1 suspect.
So now he becomes the prime suspect. We now need to look at what's the motive. So you'll extend the investigation and you'll also start looking now at all his personal life and personal technology he has. Has he got an app on his phone? What does his computer say?
And the family computer drops a bombshell discovery.
There was searches on his computer, how to kill my wife.
His searches included employing overdoses of insulin, employing perhaps strangulation.
We've also got searches on his laptop and on his phone about the fact that he will earn £2 million in insurance payouts from his wife's death.
Have police finally uncovered a motive for Jessica's murder?
These were various policies that were taken out at various times. It's interesting to note that the first policy was taken out shortly after Mitesh Patel had begun in 2013 to investigate ways to kill.
But the biggest breakthrough comes when police look at Mitesh's mobile phone, which recorded his heart rate and activity.
Mitesh Patel was not to know that he had this particular app activated on his phone. It tracks not only his steps, but also if he's done any staircases.
The app reveals to detectives that immediately after Mitesh had arrived back at the house, at a time when he said he discovered Jessica's body, he had also gone upstairs for 4 minutes before calling 999.
There was no reason, no innocent reason, for him to have done that if he was coming home to find his wife's body on the floor, just to the right of the front door.
So what had gone on that fateful day? And what was the truth behind their seemingly loving relationship?
The 14th of May seemed to have begun like most other days. It's right that Mitesh went to work early that morning. Jessica got into work herself an hour or two later. The day continued as other days. Because he'd worked the morning shift, Mitesh Patel left work. He was due to go to the gym at lunchtime, and then he went home. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the family home, and he was there when Jessica got home from work. Of course, he was to lie to the police about that, but he was there when she got home from work, shortly after 7.
Detectives established Jessica was killed soon after arriving home. And before Mitesh left the house to get pizza 42 minutes later.
After he'd murdered his wife, he left the house. He then went to the pizza parlor just down the road and ordered a takeaway.
He looked like he was on edge or there was something wrong with him, but we didn't take any notice.
He returned to the family home. He's got to have dismantled the CCTV footage, gone upstairs, hidden it, then come downstairs and then made the call.
It's emergency.
I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked.
Confident they have their man, Cleveland police make the decision to charge Mitesh for the murder of Jessica.
To be honest with you, after all that and how I was feeling, and for this to happen, you wouldn't believe, obviously, what we went through.
Having portrayed himself as the devoted husband, running a successful business with his wife and planning to start a family together, the truth behind this perfectly cultured facade was starting to unravel.
When Jessica got married to Mitesh, I think she thought that she was going to have this lovely life with this great guy who'd bought her presents and supported her through her mother's illness. But then the cracks started to show early on in the marriage.
One of the things that she found difficult was that there was not a great deal, if any, sexual activity between her and her husband.
Desperate to start a family, Jessica sought IVF treatment as an alternative way to have children. But this took a destructive toll on her well-being and the couple's relationship.
She was injecting herself in the stomach with steroids and all sorts, and at the time she ended up on antidepressants. She became such an anxious person. Mitesh would quite often blackmail her by telling her that he would leave her and their relationship would be over if she was unwilling to carry on with going through the rounds of IVF. And I think for her, that relationship falling apart would mean her dreams falling apart.
Soon enough, Mitesh's dark side was to reveal itself.
Not long after they were married, Jessica's grandfather gets ill. And in his final days, she wants to obviously spend time with her family and her grandfather. Mitesh wouldn't let her do this. And there's reports that in the car one day, she's sort of like trying to put her case for wanting to go and see her grandfather, and he doesn't want her to, and he apparently hits her. She told a family member that he put his hands around her neck and that it hurt. A pharmacy worker had seen Jessica limping, and apparently Mitesh had thrown a mobile phone at her.
And as time went on, she became not just less bubbly, but more withdrawn and even losing weight. And we all came to understand that which Jessica's family suspected, that she was being controlled and kept apart from her own blood family.
But what could have led this once happy marriage to end in tragedy? Why did Mitesh want to keep Jessica apart from her family? And why did he end her life in such a violent way? "37-year-old pharmacist Mitesh Patel has been charged with the murder of his wife Jessica in their home in the village of Linthorpe. Having pleaded not guilty, the case is sent for trial.
To be honest, we can't believe that he had the audacity to plead not guilty when there was all of this evidence against him. It was just bizarre that he would even try to, get off with this.
In December 2018, the trial begins at Teesside Crown Court.
Well, in my life, I had never gone to a court before, never ever been in a court. We knew it was coming. To be honest with you, I didn't want to be there.
For the first time since his arrest, Jessica's family comes face to face with her alleged killer.
There was a couple of times that he had the opportunity to make eye contact with the family. There was clearly no compassion in him for the fact that he had lost his wife so horrendously. He didn't at any point scream his innocence. I don't think I could ever recall him saying, "It wasn't me, it was somebody else."
The prosecution reveals how Mitesh first appeared to police.
When he was first seen by the police, it was noticed that he had scratch marks down his neck. He was in due course to explain those away as having been as a result of his session at the gym at lunchtime. Well, that was clearly not the case. Further work by the forensic scientists were to reveal that underneath the fingertips of Jessica Patel was his DNA, particularly on the right hand, and she was right-handed. So the picture began to be built up of a struggle in which Jess had fought with her attacker, and clearly that attacker was her husband, whom she had scratched down the front of his neck.
Police have never revealed what they believe to have been the murder weapon until now.
It's found that she died from pressure to her neck. At the scene in the house was a Tesco carrier bag, and tests showed that the inside of the bag had traces of Jessica's saliva and blood in there. There was also a suggestion that from marks to Jessica's neck that a ligature of some sort had been used. So it was surmised that the Tesco carrier bag had been used to suffocate Jessica.
After suffocating her, the court is told Mitesh bound her with duct tape. Crucially for the prosecution case, a reel of duct tape was discovered in the pharmacy, with police believing Mitesh hid it after going to order pizza on the night of the murder.
The jury were given both pieces to look at. They were photographed, and once the tape had been flattened, it was the clearest possible fit, just like a jigsaw puzzle. It was unique.
I was present at the court every single day. I think 95% of what came out in that courtroom we were unprepared for. There was only 5% of that we went in knowing, and that 95% was devastating. To learn what Jessica had gone through, how she had died, what he had subjected her to all those years, it was just devastating.
But the biggest shock was yet to reveal itself in the courtroom. Far from the perfect life they had portrayed to the world, it seems Jessica was harboring a secret about her husband.
Jessica found evidence on her husband's phone of the gay flings he was having and of pornography. He insisted it's banter. He insisted he loved her more than anyone. And if she wanted, he would give up seeing anyone else. He said all he wanted was her and to have their baby.
He had extramarital affairs with men. He was a regular user of the gay app, Grindr. He was caught in clinches with another man in the pharmacy, which was recorded on the pharmacy tapes.
But it soon became clear to the courtroom that Mitesh had already found another love abroad.
Messages were found on his phone from a lover in Australia who he wanted to set up another life with.
In 2011 December, on the Grindr app, he met a guy called Amit Patel.
So was Mitesh's dreams for a new life the motive behind the callous murder?
Mitesh cunningly plotted to remove Jessica from the equation. He basically wanted Jessica out of the way so that he could move on and start this new life in Australia with his apparent soulmate.
But not only did Mitesh have a secret lover who he planned to move to Australia to be with, he had an even bigger plan. Mitesh wanted to bring up a child with his new lover. The child he should have been bringing up with Jessica from the frozen IVF embryo.
I still can't believe that somebody could go down to that sort of level. He wanted to take this embryo with him to Australia. That was his plans.
After a grueling 12-day trial at Teesside Crown Court, the jury returns its verdict. Mitesh is found guilty of Jessica Patel's murder. He is sentenced to 30 years in prison.
When the judge passed the sentence of 30 years, again, his expression, I watched him the whole time, his expression was blank. Nothing at all. And he was gone in an instant, taken away in an instant.
With Mitesh now behind bars, Jessica's family is slowly coming to terms with life without her.
She was a fantastic older sister to the rest of us. I'm always going to have so many fond memories of growing up with Jess. It's just so unfortunate now that I have another memory that's so tainted. I always can't help but picture her lying there on that floor in that living room, fighting for her life. And I always think of that moment because I can only think that she must have thought of us in that moment, knowing that her life was fleeing away from her, and how desperately she must have thought, someone save me, knowing it was her husband that was doing this to her. I can't shake that moment from my head at all. It's just there forever to stay. I wish it would go away, but it just doesn't.
I want to be strong, and I want to be living the way I used to, even though I know that it's not possible, but I want to be strong. This is the worst thing that could happen on this planet, and it's happened to me and to this family. I do not want this to happen to nobody.
Even to this day, every day, and every time I think of her, there's a part of me that feels so much guilt inside of me that I couldn't do anything to affect a change. I didn't notice what was going on, but obviously there's no going back. There's no changing or undoing what's happened. But you've still got to live every day with that guilt inside of you and somehow reason with it as well.
There's a shift with the force northeast up for grabs, but watch out, it's going to be anything but plain sailing. That's Saturday at 10 on Sky Mix.
I was thinking, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
I was shielded from the raw details.
It did change the village at the time.
As a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
On the morning of the 30th of October 1966, a discovery was made that was to plunge the village of Beenham into a nightmare that its inhabitants would have to live with for nearly half a century. The village of Beanham in Berkshire is only 51 miles from London. But in 1966, this rural community may as well have been a million miles away.
Back in the 60s, we all knew each other. It was more tight-knit than it is now. It's still a very close village and everyone knows each other and looks out for each other.
In the 1960s, Beanham would have been a quiet village. We never got called up to there for any problems at all.
Early in the morning of Saturday, the 29th of October in 1966, police received a call about a missing 17-year-old au pair called Yolande Waddington.
Yolande had only been working at the farm as an au pair for a matter of days before she went missing and was then reported missing by her employer.
At the same time, a discovery was made on land belonging to the farm where Yolande was a nanny.
Some clothing was found in a barn by one of the farm workers. He thought no more of it because previously other clothes had been found there. It was a location used by courting couples.
Unaware of the clothing, police spread the word about the missing 17-year-old.
The following day, further items of clothing were also found within the barn when farm workers went and moved some bales of hay. At that point, Yolande had been reported missing, so the fact that the clothing was found in the barn, reasonably close to where she was living, raised suspicions, and her employer was called to the scene.
It didn't take long before everyone's worst nightmares were realised.
On the 30th of October, a body was found by her employer in a ditch close by to the barn where her clothing was found. She was naked, or almost naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with twine, or baling twine. She had an item of clothing wrapped around her face and stuffed into her mouth. She had an injury to her rib cage just below her left breast, and she also had baling twine wrapped around her neck. And it was that what killed her.
1966 was a time before DNA and databases. All they had was good old-fashioned police work.
It was obvious from the outset that it was a murder, and it was treated as such.
Rodney Watson and Gary Deacon were local PCs at that time.
A telephone call came in to the effect that a body had been found in a ditch in a farm track at Beanham. It was quickly established that we had received a report of a missing girl called Yolande Waddington, and as a result, I, amongst others, went to the scene to secure the scene.
Murders weren't known in those days as such, so everybody was sort of rushing around trying to get things organised, and I had to go to sort of do the search that was going to be taking place at the scene. We were greeted with open fields, rural tracks, the barn down the road, and farm tracks, and basically all rural area. We were searching at the time with sort of what would be garden instruments, the rake, hose, garden forks, shears for cutting the grass.
The atmosphere at the scene was quite sombre. Obviously, it was realised that the body in the ditch was a female and matched the description of Yolande Waddington, and she'd obviously passed away.
You'd read about it in textbooks and everything, and you'd done it at a training school, but to be actually involved in a murder search was an experience.
I actually conveyed Yolande Waddington to the Royal Berkshire Hospital, to the mortuary. I mean, I was thinking, you know, who would be capable of such a heinous crime?
Identified by her employer, police were dispatched to give Yolande Waddington's family the horrific news. Giles, Yolande's younger brother, was 8 in 1966.
But I do recall this picture of opening the front door and finding a policeman in his full sort of uniform standing in front of me going, "I need to speak to your mum and dad." And that's the only real record I have. And then I have recollections of lots of people being in the house that were a bit unusual. And I would assume, in that case, there were various detectives.
This had been Yolande's first job away from the family home in Newbury, and despite only being in Beanham a few days, she was known as a friendly, talkative girl. News of the murder travelled through this country village fast.
I can remember the police presence. There were suddenly lots of policemen everywhere. When you came out of school or if you went to the village shop, there were policemen around, and it is quite memorable, something like that. It did change the village at the time then.
Berkshire was really a rural county, and apart from the normal problems that you had, maybe the occasional pub fights at the weekend, murders were unknown as such.
A call was made to London.
In 1966, it was standard practice for the Berkshire Constabulary to request the assistance of a Detective Chief Superintendent and a Detective Sergeant from the Metropolitan Police.
And it was felt that Metropolitan officers had the necessary experience and expertise in order to lead on these rare and serious offences.
With Scotland Yard on the scene, the investigation continued.
In the following days, a thorough search took place of the barn in the immediate area. Various items were seized. Sacks from within the barn, Yolande's clothing, a comb was found, a knife was found, which was believed to have been the knife that caused her injury.
The items were sent to the Metropolitan Police Lab in London for analysis, and then officers concentrated on piecing together Yolande's final movements.
Yolande Waddington was last seen on Friday the 28th of October 1966 in the Six Bells public house, Beanham. She got in there to buy a packet of cigarettes. She appears to have smoked one of the cigarettes within the bar and then left. That was the last time she was seen. It was always felt, I believe, that the offender would have lived in and around the Beanham area because of the isolated nature of where Yolande was found and the fact where she was last seen within the village centre. And therefore, investigators felt that the answer to who was responsible laid within the village. Everyone within the village was interviewed. The inquiry centred on who was within the Six Bells at the time she was, who left shortly after she did, and if they did leave, where did they go?
During their inquiries, officers began unearthing information that could prove crucial to capturing Yolande's killer.
The landlady of the Six Bells was interviewed. She remembers selling a packet of cigarettes to a girl fitting Yolande's description. A man by the name of David Burgess was in the pub at the same time Yolande was there. He'd been there the majority of the evening and left shortly after she did.
Just days after the brutal murder of teenager Yolande Waddington, police already had a suspect. In 1966, the rural village of Beanham in Berkshire was left reeling when the body of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington was found naked and strangled in a farm ditch. Local police had been bolstered by the arrival of the Met Scotland Yard. Items belonging to Yolande found at the scene had immediately been sent for analysis, and after a few days, they already had a suspect, a local man called David Burgess.
He was of interest because he was in the pub, the Six Bells, at the time Yolande was there, and left shortly after she did. The following day, he was seen with scratches on his face. He stated that he'd fallen into a bush on his way home. Police spoke to him. He stated he had been in the Six Bells and then had walked home from the Six Bells.
With nothing else to go on, 19-year-old local lad David Burgess was released, and the investigation moved on.
Everyone within the village was interviewed to establish where they were on the Friday that Yolande went missing.
Over the next few weeks, the usually quiet village of Beanham was a hive of police activity as they hunted Yolande's murderer.
I can remember the parents being really quite concerned of us kids going out to play, and the people in the village were quite scared.
At the time, our school was just down at the end of the lane there, and we used to just run up the lane and round and home. But once this happened, then all the mums were always at the school to meet us and walk us home. The police presence outside the hall, they were always there every day, which was obviously quite strange for Beenham to have so many police around.
There's always ripples to any murder, but in a very small community, I think that those ripples are felt very, very keenly. Immediately, you start to look at your neighbour and feel suspicious, and immediately there's a fear, and a fear of people who are close to you and known to you. This is not the kind of thing that happens to us. It's the kind of thing that we read about in newspapers, or we watch in plots on TV or in Hollywood films.
After almost 2 weeks of inquiries, where over 1,000 statements were taken, Yolandi's clothing and effects had been analysed. The results were to send the investigation in a direction that would end up making history.
During the investigation at the barn, her jumper was found. On that jumper was blood. When that blood was examined, it was found not to be hers. Following that, it was decided to request blood from every person, every male, over the age of 16 that lived in and around Beenham.
This was a bold move by police, as the science behind it was in its infancy.
Limitations of forensic science testing in the 1960s basically revolved around the limitations of testing for blood. We knew that there were 4 blood groups, and you could break it down a little bit more, but you could never rule somebody conclusively in as a suspect. You could only rule them conclusively out.
Progress, though, had recently been made.
In 1966, 2 forensic serologists working for the Metropolitan Police came up with what they thought would be a new technique that could be used for forensic applications. The new application would help to further distinguish individuals on the basis of their blood.
By early November 1966, police decided to push on with what became the first mass blood screening ever attempted in the UK.
Posters were put around the village inviting men over 16 to give blood, and also showing a knife similar to the one found in the barn. Following the publication of those photos, David Burgess approached an officer within the village and told him that he wants to own a knife very similar to that.
Yolande's murder would have been very big news in a very small village. So here is a concerned citizen who is giving police information about a knife that they've recently lost. That's very helpful, but it becomes slightly more suspicious when you also factor into account that Burgess was also the last person to see Yolande alive.
Before a single blood sample had been taken, David Burgess had re-emerged as the police's main suspect.
David Burgess was arrested. In interview, he stuck to his story. The fact that he was in the pub, he couldn't dispute that because other customers had seen him. And the scratches, he explained those by saying he'd fallen into a bush on his way home because he'd had too much to drink.
Despite letting him go again, David Burgess, who worked at the local gravel pits and was already known to the police as a troublemaker, soon became the subject of gossip amongst the local bobbies.
I was kept abreast of things through snippets of colleagues who were undertaking the parts of the inquiry teams, and it became obvious that David Burgess was the chief suspect, although it was proving difficult to back up his claims with actually corroborative evidence.
Frustrated they couldn't prove Burgess's guilt, police continued looking into other local men.
My dad actually got arrested for the murder for Yolande, because what happened was the bus stop used to be outside the Six Bells pub, and he was in the pub and he had a Land Rover, and he said to her, because he was tipping down around, sit in my Land Rover while you wait for the bus. And somebody must have clocked that, and he got arrested and taken in, but in the next day was released, so they know he never done it.
There are 16 men that were of particular interest to the investigation. However, one by one, those men were eliminated.
With the investigation floundering, police still had what they hoped would be the ace up their sleeve. On November the 23rd, 1966, blood samples were taken from every male between the ages of 16 and 50 living in Beenham.
In excess of 200 men had their blood taken. The type of blood grouping that was done was new.
This case was certainly one of the first times that mass blood screening was used. The most well-known instance happened in the 1980s, but this predates it by at least 20 years.
Police were hoping that identifying whose blood was on Yolande's jumper would lead them to her killer.
They were able to say that only 2% of the population would have had blood of that type, and that was borne out by the fact that out of in excess of 200 men that gave their blood, only 4 people had the same blood grouping as that found on Yolande's jumper.
Police were desperately hoping David Burgess was one of them.
It wasn't his blood on the jumper, or his blood didn't appear to match the grouping that was found on Yolande's jumper, so there wasn't a great deal more that the police could do. With the 4 men whose blood matched the grouping of the blood found on Yolande's jumper, they were all subject of intense investigation. All of them had alibis for what they were doing, and therefore were ruled out of the investigation.
It had been a massive gamble to take this unprecedented step in the investigation. Unfortunately, it hadn't paid off, and the police were back to square one.
The investigation were obviously limited as to what they could do forensically. They did all they could in relation to try and show who was at the scene with Yolande, but back in 1966, they couldn't progress it.
With no new evidence coming to light, there was a difficult decision to make.
The investigation finished in March 1967. The officers had done all they could to try and establish who was responsible for Yolande's death, but unfortunately, after almost 6 months, they had no evidence that could be used to charge someone with her death.
I imagine that the killer would be feeling that they'd gotten away with it, they'd been successful, and they'd be feeling quite a thrill from that. They'd be feeling empowered and invincible.
The investigation was never officially closed, and suspicions remained about David Burgess. But for now, the evidence from the scene was stored for future analysis. Despite all the police's efforts, the murder of Yolande Waddington remained unsolved. After 6 months, the investigation into the murder of 17-year-old au pair Yolande Waddington had been stopped. The village of Beenham looked as if it was going to be living with a killer on the loose for the foreseeable future. Inquiries may have ended, but despite there not being a match in the UK's first mass blood screening, local troublemaker David Burgess remained the police's prime suspect. This was a village on the edge. On the 17th of April 1967, the village of Beenham hit the news again.
We've got another call come in to say that 2 9-year-old girls hadn't returned home after going out to play in the village of Beenham. And we all thought, no, this cannot be. Surely nothing's happened to them. But I attended with a lot of officers, probably 20 to 30, and volunteers from the village. And we searched the area by some gravel pits, and having been issued with the whistles to blow if anything was found, after about half an hour or so, somebody blew a whistle.
The whistle could mean only one thing.
When the call came in to say 2 bodies had been found, then you get a bit disheartened, you think, how sad. And it was a lonely area, these 2 young children as they were out there on their own, and something had happened. Devastating, really, yes.
The awful news reverberated around the village.
We were really in shock, and the teachers were in shock, parents were in shock. It was really quite scary, actually.
Police quickly got to work. They were determined that this murder would not go unsolved.
It was obvious that these two girls had been murdered, so an investigation took place.
It wasn't long before police had a person of interest, and the name didn't come as much of a surprise.
Because David Burgess was one of the main suspects in the Yolandes case, the fact that he worked so close to where the bodies of the two 9-year-olds were found made him a strong suspect almost from the outset. He was interviewed, his clothing was seized, and from one of his boots some blood was found, and that blood grouping matched one of the girls.
David Burgess was charged with the monstrous killing of the two 9-year-old girls, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams.
We'd heard that Burgess had been arrested on the possibility of committing the murders of the two schoolgirls, and I suppose we were all really delighted.
In July of 1967, just 4 months after the horrific killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline, David Burgess was presented at Reading Crown Court accused of their murder. It was a swift, uncomplicated hearing.
Burgess stood trial and was convicted of both the murders of both 9-year-olds in July 1967.
Escorted to his life sentence by Rodney Watson, Burgess's behaviour was, under the circumstances, bizarre.
I was handcuffed to him in the dock, but most of the time he didn't really seem worried about what was happening. He kept on looking round, occasionally laughing, chuckling to himself, and not really worried about proceedings. And a very strange person I found to be in that position. I would have been worried myself. And then he was remanded in custody and then taken down and then released into the prison authorities. And that was the last time I ever saw him, in fact.
Now, I know that when I assess psychopaths, some of the things that I look for are callousness, lack of empathy, but just a general blunting of emotional response and effect. Now, here is somebody who is acting very oddly indeed. We know that he's not got a mental illness, but you have to question what else is going on.
Rodney's macabre introduction to the darker side of police work was over. But there was still one question that remained unanswered. Who had murdered Yolande Waddington? In 1968, a potential answer came from prison.
David Burgess admitted to being responsible for causing Yolande's death to a prison officer, and that prison officer subsequently made a statement to police.
Could the man who police had always suspected of Yolande's depraved murder be confessing?
On April 3rd, 1968, Burgess was interviewed in prison by police officers in relation to the admissions he'd made concerning Yolande's death. To those officers, he said words to the effect of, "You'll have to prove it."
The fact that somebody was prepared to indulge in this sort of conversation and admissions and them saying you prove it as if it was some sort of game, totally disrespectful to the girl and the family and the family of the two other girls.
In talking about Yolande's murder and taking responsibility for that murder, Burgess is meeting two needs. First of all, he's letting people know how clever he is because he's got away with murder. But also, crucially, he's re-engaging with that murder and re-engaging with the emotions that that murder brought about in him. So he's feeling powerful, he's feeling a thrill. And let's face it, when you're incarcerated, there are very few other outlets for that type of thing. If you can't commit a murder, you talk about a murder.
Police decided to test Burgess's blood one more time.
Following his admissions, the jumper was tested yet again in relation to the blood found, and a report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions. However, the blood grouping still didn't match that of Burgess, and as a result of that, the Director of Public Prosecutions stated that he didn't believe it was worthwhile pursuing the charge against Burgess.
It was a bitter blow, and it was looking like Yolande's murder was never going to be solved. In 1996, 48-year-old convicted double child murderer David Burgess absconded from open prison.
At one point, Burgess was on the run for in the region of 18 months and took over the identity of someone that he knew that had died. Was subsequently arrested when he committed an armed robbery. We don't know where he was throughout the 18 months.
Sexual offending by its nature is addictive, and here is an individual who would be at very high risk of reoffending. But that's not to say that other murders would be inevitable, although they are possible.
When I heard that he'd escaped from an open prison, my thoughts were, how could somebody who's killed two 9-year-old girls be deemed safe to allow out into the public?
By February 1998, David Burgess was back in prison, whilst Beanham tried to get back to normal. But the village always had a cloud hanging over it.
There's a very good history of Beanham, which was written by the local history group some 10 years ago now, but it doesn't mention the murders.
It was a subject that was almost taboo.
I would say I would very rarely hear anyone talking about it here in the pub.
As many try to forget, Giles, Yolandi's younger brother, was just finding out the full horror of what had happened to his sister.
I discovered a pile of press cuttings hidden away out of view. Obviously being put away so that I didn't find them, but I did, and there was this sort of Yolandi's photograph plastered on the front page, and there were sort of police and other sort of articles. So I found out a little bit to know that my sister had been murdered.
With David Burgess safely back behind bars, advances were being made in DNA analysis, meaning previously unsolved murders were worth revisiting.
In 1985, research published at the University of Leicester proved that new DNA analysis techniques could be used to link specific individuals to offences, and has since been used in many different capacities to solve homicides and sexual assault cases.
This breakthrough led to cold case units being set up by police forces around the country.
I retired in 2007 and then came back in my current role as a member of police staff, reinvestigating historic cases.
Eventually, in September 2010, the Thames Valley Major Crime Review Team turned their attention to the unsolved murder of Yolandi Waddington.
So with Yolandi's case, we initially looked at what the case was about, looked at what case papers we had, and importantly what exhibits we had, and did an audit of those exhibits to see what was still in existence, and then did an assessment as to what potential there was to use new forensic techniques on those exhibits.
Could advances in forensic sciences finally help police find Yolandi's killer 44 years after her murder? Up until 2010, the 1966 murder of Yolandi Waddington remained unsolved, despite the police believing that double child murderer David Burgess had been responsible from the very beginning. Then Thames Valley Police decided to reopen Yolandi's case to see if DNA could identify and convict her killer. The new investigation began by finding out what evidence had survived.
We had items that were found in the barn, some items of her clothing, but importantly, what was missing was the oatmeal jumper that Yolandi was wearing at the time of her death. That was an item from which a bloodstain was found, which wasn't hers, and it was that bloodstain, the grouping from that bloodstain, which was used on the initial investigation to get the blood grouping with which to match against people from within the village.
As the only item belonging to Yolandi with someone else's blood on it, the missing jumper was a big blow.
There were another key items that still did exist, and it was those that we were able to submit to the forensic laboratories for further work to take place.
By January 2011, police managed to recover Yolandi's headband and a plastic fertiliser bag. Now it was up to the lab to find DNA not belonging to Yolandi.
We here at LGC have a cold case team that is dedicated just to cold cases. We'll use whatever available technology is there in order to try and help solve the case.
Locating the evidence was only half the battle. Usable DNA needed to be found.
One of the most important items was the polythene fertiliser bag that was found at the scene of the crime. Because the original note suggested there was blood on there, and obviously they'd got blood grouping results from that item. So we went back to it, and sure enough, there were still crusty blood stains on that item. We then sampled some of those stains and carried out DNA profiling on them and got a good profile.
The lab was quick to give Thames Valley Police the news.
And they said that they had a profile. That profile, a DNA profile that is, that profile was then searched against the National DNA Database, and there was a match against David Burgess.
Already in prison for double murder, David Burgess was in the frame again. But it did pose the question, why hadn't he been a match when he was tested in 1966 or 68?
I would have expected him to match it if the test had been carried out correctly. And unfortunately, we can't go back and recheck that particular test, and we don't have any documentation in order to see whether there might have been a transcription error, a problem in moving information of the actual type onto another page that was used in a report, for example.
As far as the team were concerned, Burgess's blood had been incorrectly categorised in the 60s. But persuading a jury of this wouldn't be easy. They had to use the DNA to prove that the blood had always belonged to Burgess.
Although it was good evidence to have Burgess's DNA on that sack, the problem we had was that he was a local young man, would have had ready access to that barn, so we had to get evidence over and above that, because potentially he could have just said, yes, that's my DNA, I'm local, so what?
Roy Green and his team at LGC continued investigating the evidence.
As we looked through the old case notes that were prepared over 40 years previously, we noticed that one of them, the headband, had a description of it saying grubby, and that was it. But on examining the item, we found that what were thought to be grubby marks were actually blood. The DNA profiling results showed that there was a mixture of DNA on the headband. Some of it could have come from Yolandi, and that's to be expected because it was her item. But also, some of it could have come from David Burgess.
If Burgess's DNA was definitely on the headband, it would show that he'd come into direct contact with Yolandi. Police had to prove beyond any doubt that the DNA was his.
We had to refer to a specialist in genetic statistics at UCL, and he was able to say that, in his opinion, the DNA profile found on her headband was a 1 in a billion match probability to Burgess.
A 1 billion to 1 match was conclusive proof that Burgess and Yolandi had had physical contact. It was time to let the surviving members of Yolandi's family know what was happening.
I tend to try and only make contact with the family when we have new evidence, which hopefully will bring their case to a successful conclusion. In Yolandi's case, I approached Giles, her brother.
There wasn't a sort of sense of relief, a sense of... I can't say that I felt anything. It's a process. And it still feels as though it's a process because it makes no difference to the end result. Yolandi is dead, never to be alive again. The bit that I was worried about was the impact it would have on my dad in his twilight days.
For the police, turning failed investigations around wasn't just about pride.
Each one of our undetected cases has obviously a victim and the victim's family. The impact on families is massive, in as much that it's difficult to comprehend what that family's gone through. And when we visit them sort of 10, 20, 30 years after the event, you can still see the impact, in as much that there's a picture of their loved one either on the television, on the mantelpiece, and it never goes away. It's something that they think about every day.
My parents were certainly not wanting a repeat. Well, their trust in anybody disappeared, evaporated completely, for the simple reason that their precious daughter had been taken from them.
Pete Byrne and his team had to put together a case to back up the DNA.
It's really, really pleasing to get the forensic result, but that's just the start of it, really. From that moment on, we then have to look at the case and build the case up against Burgess.
Police had to painstakingly trawl through all the evidence from 1966 and find the original witnesses.
They were all seen, if they were still alive, interviewed, asked in relation to their initial statement whether they wanted to add, alter or correct anything in relation to what they'd said back in '66 to what they could remember in 2011.
In November 2011, the prime suspect in 17-year-old Nanny Yolandi Waddington's murder was interviewed about some of the original evidence from 1966 that had implicated him.
Did you get those scratches because Yolandi scratched your face?
I had nothing whatsoever to do with her death. I've told you that, and you won't believe it because I'm a liar, you said. We're saying the knife that you lost is identical. You say you lost. Is identical to the knife that was used to murder Yolanda Waddington. That's a coincidence, Sam, isn't it? Your missing knife is the same knife that was used. How many people in Venham had a knife that's similar? How many people? Are they all suspects, aren't they?
Finally, Burgess was asked about his confession to prison guards.
And you thought it was safe to say that here?
No.
It was safe, wasn't it?
I'd never say something like that if I committed a murder. I wouldn't go around shouting about it.
After we finished interviewing Burgess and he was charged, we then carried on building the case up against him, putting the file in to the CPS, and then getting ready for the trial.
45 years after he'd first been the main suspect in Yolandi Waddington's brutal killing, David Burgess was going to stand trial for her murder.
It's not every day that you get told that your sister's murderer has just been arrested. It was a sort of sense of, wow, that's progress, and significant progress.
On the 18th of June 2012, David Burgess stood trial at Reading Crown Court.
I was confident in the results that we'd obtained, but in the background there was always this mistyping of the original blood grouping results that could be a potential stumbling block.
If the defence could sway the court into believing there was no way that the two blood tests done on Burgess in the 60s could have been wrong, he'd get off the murder of Yolandi yet again. It was a difficult time for Giles.
There is no provision whatsoever for, or any preparation that can prepare anybody for facing a trial as a victim's relative.
For David Burgess, it all seemed nothing more than an inconvenience.
I saw him throughout the trial. His attitude didn't seem to have changed at all from when we'd first interviewed him. He just simply appeared bored by the whole proceedings.
The jury and Giles were told all the grisly details.
The fact that she'd been found naked, her clothes had been strewn about, she'd been stabbed, she'd been strangled, the whole thing had been a sexual crime. And that's the bit that was uncomfortable because I found it out for the first time.
Through expert witnesses, the prosecution explained how the original blood tests must have been wrong, and more witnesses called.
One of the key points of the trial was a witness that we'd located in Australia who was living in Beanham just prior to the murder. She gave evidence to the effect that Burgess had attacked her one evening prior to the attack on Yolande. We were able to use that evidence, what's called bad character evidence, put that before the jury to show the type of man Burgess was.
Once all the witnesses found by Pete Byrne and his team had given evidence, there was only the DNA left.
We're fortunate that the scientist was able to explain to the jury in layman's terms what that DNA consisted of and how he was confident that the DNA that was found on the items belonged to Burgess.
In the end, everything relied upon the jury understanding the complex evidence.
The trial lasted 5 weeks in total. The jury were out for 5 days, after which they came back with an 11-1 majority verdict that Burgess was the killer.
On the 23rd of July 2012, almost half a century after Yolande Waddington's murder, David Burgess was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. It was a huge relief to Giles.
For want of the better expression, shouted from the rooftops to say, no matter how old the crime, the resources are now there to provide justice now.
He should be 92 years of age when he's released. I don't think he should ever be released.
Burgess is clearly a sexually motivated repeat killer, and you do wonder how his killing career would have been progressing had he not been caught. But as a fledgling serial killer, and that's what he is, I'm glad that at least he was nipped in the bud.
We're very, very pleased that we got the result, but that's what me and my team do. We reinvestigate the historic cases that are unresolved.
Burgess was sent back to prison, but questions were raised about the 18 months he'd been on the run.
We made sure that forces were also made aware that there was a convicted killer that potentially could have committed offences anywhere within the UK within that time, so we passed on his details to other forces.
By the time Burgess is eligible for parole, he will have spent 73 years behind bars for the 3 murders the police know he's committed. The question is, are there more?
Join the team and face the day-to-day struggle of stamping out crime. Leave it to the experts. Saturday at 10 in the Force Northeast.
My husband come flying around the corner in our car, and I just said, "Is she dead?" And he said, "Yeah."
This is a grandmother who's been shot in a car park of the block of flats where she lives.
If you were to put a list of places where somebody could be shot in the head, Earls Barton wouldn't register.
We were catapulted into a world that we had no idea on. We weren't from any kind of criminal background.
Who's done this? What's their motive for doing this? Is there any other risk to the wider public?
Contact made on this door. Yeah. He knew what was going to happen, he helped what was going to happen, and he helped cover up what had happened.
This case was about a carefully planned, cold-blooded murder. It was also about a brutal betrayal between old friends.
In the heart of Northamptonshire, on the banks of the River Nene, lies the ancient and thriving village of Earls Barton.
Earls Barton is an incredibly busy village, a lively village, full of people, generations, family.
Nice village. It's been a nice village for years, and it's always been a community village, so everyone gets involved with everything, and most people know most people.
It's kind of tucked away from nowhere. You'd never find it unless you stumbled across it, but it's a real gem, I think, of the county.
So you've got your doctors, your chemists, the schools, the butchers, the bakers, pretty much the candlestick makers.
I can honestly say Earlsbarton is the best place I've ever lived and worked in. It's a place where people genuinely love each other, they genuinely care about each other. It's a place where community comes very naturally to the people here.
And it's this close-knit, safe community that attracted Marion Price and her family to set up home.
My mum was originally from Liverpool. She moved down with one of her other sisters and ended up meeting my dad, falling in love and getting married.
With 2 children to care for, Marion juggled home life with work as a bursar at a local nursery school.
My mum was always cleaning when we were younger. That's all I ever remember. She'd got the Motown on or just any kind of music, and she'd be cleaning and washing the windows every Saturday. Just always singing and dancing and just happy, really, yeah.
Yeah, she's one of those people. She loved working with the children. She loved the colleagues she worked with. She was always looking to make people smile, looking to make people happy. If someone was down, she would always try and help them and cheer them up. And she was just a lovely person to be around.
And family was everything to Marion.
Marion Price was a loving grandmother, mother, daughter, sister. She was a family woman, she was bubbly, she had a big family support around her.
We were always getting together, barbecues, Christmases, Easter. You know, it was a very big family.
When their children were older, Marion and her husband separated, but remained the closest of friends.
I was about 21 when Mum and Dad divorced. You know, they were separated on good terms.
In their divorce settlement, basically my mum kept the house and my dad kept the land on the side, and he eventually built the house and ended up living next door to my mum for quite a while. So yeah, it was very amicable between my mum and my dad.
Despite having her family around her, as the years passed, Marion felt something was missing.
So when my mum and dad parted ways, she was a bit of a lost soul for a while, and you know, she was sort of missing that family setup.
She was looking to spend her days with somebody, go on holiday with somebody, you know, sort of grow old with somebody that she could have fun with, which I think, you know, that's all anybody wants, isn't it? Like to either be looked after or just have a companion. I mean, she's got her friends and obviously us, but you go home on your own at the end of the day, don't you?
So I suggested online dating. You know, she went on a few dates and then she met Michael Reader.
To everyone's surprise, Marion's relationship with Michael moved fast.
It was a bit of a whirlwind romance. They were very quickly engaged and very quickly married.
And she was just like, no, I'm certain. She was, you know, he makes me laugh, he's funny, and she was happy.
After a few years married, the relationship ran its course and the couple separated. And by December 2019, Marion was excitedly making plans to spend Christmas with son Gary.
So I was speaking to my mum a lot on the phone, and she was just really excited to come down for Christmas and see our brand new house, really.
But 10 days before Christmas, life for everyone was to change forever.
Got a phone call off my friend who lives in the same block of flats as my mum. She said, you know, that your mum's car windows are smashed in. And then she'd gone back outside to look into the car and then saw my mum. She said, your mum's unconscious, I think you need to get round here.
I was at home, off work, and my partner was working, but he came home about 4 o'clock, and so we were just having a couple of drinks, celebrating a few days off together, and I think it was about 8 o'clock, I got a phone call from my sister, and she was crying, and my face immediately dropped, and I was like, what's wrong? And she told me that Mum's been attacked.
Tony's husband, Scott, immediately dashed to the scene to check on Marion.
My husband come flying around the corner in our car, and then he said, get in the car. He started driving to the hospital, and I just said, is she dead? And he said, yeah.
and I remember just falling to the floor and screaming, and the rest of that evening's a complete blur, if I'm honest. It was just, you know, you go from complete elation, having a good Sunday evening, to your whole world just crumbling.
I was on call this weekend. It was a Sunday night. I remember it really well, actually. It was about sort of 8 o'clock time. The first call was just, right, we've got a lady in a car in a quiet little village outside a block of flats. Windows have all been put in, and we think she's got a significant head injury. So I got in the car and I drove to the scene immediately, really. I knew it was one that I'd have to go to.
On arrival in Earls Barton, the true horror of the scene before him unfolded.
Driving to the States, Christmas lights up everywhere. The victim's car, Marion's car, with the window smashed. The scenes of crime manager has seen Marion and assessed the scene. He said to me, look, this looks like a firearms discharge.
Police immediately launch a murder investigation.
Earls Barton is one of the last places in Northamptonshire that you'd imagine something like this happening. If you were to put a list of places where somebody could be shot in the head, Earls Barton wouldn't register.
In the quaint village of Earls Barton, Northamptonshire police have just launched a murder investigation after 63-year-old grandmother Marion Price was found dead in her car.
It was confirmed by our family liaison officer that she died from a single shotgun wound to the head through her car door. I mean, she hadn't even taken her seatbelt off, and she was shot through the window.
The majority of the murders we deal with most recently have been knife-related, knife crime or drunken incidents that are just accidents that have happened and have ended in tragedy. This was somebody's actually shot her through the window of her car. It was extraordinary. She just isn't the type of victim that you'd expect a gun crime incident to have occurred for.
She had no enemies, you know. It was just a far cry from the world that we're all from. You know, I mean, we don't know anyone with guns, we don't know criminals of that level. Like, it was all too much to take in. It was horrendous.
This is a grandmother who's been shot in the car park of the block of flats where she lives. Who's done this? What's their motive for doing this? Is there any other risk to the wider public?
Immediately, police seal off the village, sending shockwaves throughout the community.
So lots of residents in the area woke up on Monday morning to see police tape everywhere, people in white forensic suits, and the first thought was, what on earth has happened here?
It's just unbelievable that gradually the village wakes up to a scenario that nobody can quite believe has really happened, especially when it's somebody you've been familiar with.
The community started to learn the nature of what happened to Marion. It came as a huge shock because of the intensity of the violence of the crime.
There was a little bit of fear that someone's going round, someone's shooting somebody in a residential area that's quiet. How has this happened?
Forensic officers scour the scene, desperate for clues as to who could have carried out this atrocious crime.
This lady just parked her car, literally turned it off, and someone shot her in the head at point-blank range. You think that means somebody's had to have been there before her, had to have been hiding in the dark, because it was... We narrowed it down eventually to about 5 o'clock it probably happened, but it's 5 o'clock in the middle of December, very cold, very sort of damp that evening, and you think somebody's laid in wait for her. And you think, who's going to have done that?
The evidence from the forensic scientists showed that Marion had been shot by somebody effectively standing at the door of her car. It also showed that prior to being shot, she had put up her hand to try and protect her head. Completely futile, tragically, in the circumstances, because there was injuries to the hand which showed that to be the case.
Police established that on the morning of the 15th of December, Marion had visited her sister to get her hair done. From there, she did some grocery shopping for her mum, dropped that at her house before arriving back at her flat around 5 p.m. She was shot dead before she'd even had a chance to take off her seatbelt. One theory is immediately ruled out.
It was obvious from the outset that this wasn't some robbery, because her handbag and its content was still in the passenger front footwell.
With no murder weapon at the scene, police have to consider something even more terrifying.
You've got almost what looks to be almost like gangland-style execution has happened in the middle of this little village.
I think our initial thoughts were it could be a contract killing, because we didn't know anyone else that would have anything to do with something like that.
With the shooting showing all the hallmarks of a professional hit, police need to establish if Marion was the target, or was it a case of mistaken identity? So delve deeper into life with her second husband, Michael Reeder.
Can't really pinpoint the time that she started to change, but it was definitely not long after they got married. I would say probably within the year, she started to look tired. She wasn't putting makeup on.
It seemed like he was charming all the right people. He was doing lovely things for my sister's kids. He was going golfing with my brother-in-law. He was nice and pleasant to the people he needed to be at the time. But I would see different traits in my mum that just wasn't my mum. She'd lost her spark.
I could see she wasn't happy, but I think she didn't want to be seen as a failure. Like, you know, I married him really quick, people didn't approve, you know, they're going to say, I told you so. So she tried to stick it out.
In 2017, Marion and Michael split up.
When my mum left him, she called me straight away and just said, I've left Mike. And it was like this weight was just lifted off my shoulder. She was like, this is the next chapter of my life now. Like, I'm going to enjoy it. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And yeah, she was just really excited about what was to come.
And in November 2019, the couple decided to make their separation official.
They were divorced, and just a month before that Marion was shot, he'd been ordered to pay her £10,000 at a court hearing.
After the court, the next few days, he was due to pay that £10,000 into my mum's bank on the 16th of December.
But the day before the money was due to be paid, Marion's life was cruelly taken from her. Something police believe is no coincidence.
I suspected instantly that the person who has had to pay her money in an acrimonious divorce battle has a motive. And he's a very good suspect. So I'd sent some uniformed resources. They were firearms officers that went round to arrest him.
Hold this door. Yeah. Contact made at the front with Mr. Reeder. Yeah, he's just putting his dog indoors. You're all right. Right, just come in, Mr. Reeder. Pop your lolly down somewhere. My friend, I need to have a chat with you. Just come in.
He opened the door, still holding an ice cream in his hand, when the officers said that his ex-wife had been found dead.
At this moment in time, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder of your ex-partner. You do not have to say anything, ma'am. Your defence, you're not meant to be in question something that's regular in court, and you do say it may be given evidence. Your arrest is necessary for a prompt investigation to that offence and to secure evidence. Do you understand that? Just put your hands like that for me. You want your own in the house? You are.
When we've heard that he'd been arrested, we all were relieved. So it was a big, huge sigh of relief that he'd been arrested.
Just waiting for another car to come, and you're going to be taken to Criminal Justice Centre. All right? Yeah. Where you'll be spoken to further about this incident. All right. Fill me in. What's happened? You're under caution, sir. I'll just remind you, you do not have to say anything. Mainly in defence, you do not mention in question something that's regular in court, and you do say maybe evidence. All right? Have a seat. When did this happen? Early this evening, sir. Have a seat. Your ex-partner is Marion Price. Yeah.
You know, who else would have wanted to hurt my mum? Nobody. Absolutely nobody.
Michael Reader is taken in for questioning, but having found no murder weapon at the scene or at Michael's home, the police have little to link him to the crime scene and need to establish if he pulled the trigger or ordered the hit on Marion.
Very pressured environment because we've got an initial 24 hours, then we can ask a superintendent internally for another 12. We didn't have any sort of fingerprints or anything like that on the car at the time that we could tie him to. We didn't get anything back from our fast-track submissions to the forensic lab, so we couldn't forensically initially put him there at the crime scene. We just were left with, he's done this. He's got to have done this.
But police have no concrete evidence tying Reader to the murder. Time is running out to keep him in custody, and police searching his home have found nothing of interest.
Couldn't find a mobile phone for him, which is unusual. I know he was sort of late 60s at the time, but everyone has a mobile phone.
They looked at his bank accounts, and his bank account revealed a direct debit to a mobile phone company. The police don't need the handset in order to get the information they need from a mobile phone. They need the data from that phone, and that can be obtained through the phone company.
Information from Michael Reader's mobile phone data soon turned the investigation on its head.
So we get this call data. It's got a monthly contract phone. This is the number of it, and these are all the people he's called. And his top contact is somebody called Stephen Welch. And he's in contact with this guy all the time. Literally, it's 90% of his calls are backwards and forwards Stephen Welch. So you're thinking, right, Stephen Welch is somebody who's of definite interest to us.
So who is Stephen Welch? And what is his link to Michael Reader? And what does he know about the brutal killing of Marion?
Michael Reader's best friend was a man named Stephen Welch. They'd known each other for decades. They played snooker 7 days a week. They even went round and had sort of family parties together. They were almost like brothers.
Reader and Welsh went back years. I recall that, as far as Stephen was concerned, they'd met when they were probably in their 20s. So they'd known each other for about 40 years. And they'd met in the local motor trade. It was almost as if he was attracted to Reader like a moth to a flame. He looked on Reader really as an older brother. Reader was about 10 years older. Reader had the nice house, the E-type Jag, the snooker table. Stephen didn't really have anybody.
So I sent some cops down a couple of days in to go and speak to Stephen Welch. Find out, is he a suspect? Is he a witness? What do you know about Michael Reader? What do you know about where he was? After persistent knocking, his flatmate answered. And his flatmate sort of like, oh no, I dropped him off at the airport.
Welch's flatmate reveals he flew to Alicante just hours after Marion was shot dead. Immediately, police get a warrant to search his address. And finally, there's a breakthrough.
We found a phone that turned out to be Michael Reader's phone on his bedside cabinet. And we found a tracking device inside the glove box of his car.
They could then establish in the course of their investigation that the tracking device, which has a SIM card, just like a mobile phone, had been placed on Marion's car. He had been tracking his ex-wife the course of the past year.
In Northampton, officers investigating the shooting of grandmother Marion Price have arrested 70-year-old Michael Reader on suspicion of murder.
I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder.
What? In the house. What? You are.
But now they have another man in their sights, his friend Stephen Welch, who appears to have fled to Spain on the night of the murder.
So he's raised to suspect status because I think that this is somebody that's helped Michael Reader do this because of the calls backwards and forwards and calls on the day of the offence, the days leading up to offence. They're in constant contact. So I thought, right, Michael Reader has done this. He needed some help. This is the man that's helped him.
When we found out there was a second suspect, it just opened up so many other questions as to why that person would want to be involved. Why has he been drawn into this horrendous plan?
But while searching 61-year-old Welch's home, not only have police found Reader's mobile phone, they've discovered a tracking device, which very quickly reveals some startling information.
What we started to understand is that Michael Reader's phone was in contact with a tracking device for a period of about a year. Marion's car and the tracking device are in the same places at the same time. So we know the tracking device has been in the vicinity of Earls Barn, where she lives.
The discovery of the tracker device in Stephen Welch's car and the linking of that tracker device to Michael Reader's phone showed that this was a man who was obsessed with where his ex-wife was and what she was doing. It is not a normal thing in the aftermath of even the most antagonistic of divorces for an ex-husband to put a tracker device on his ex-wife's car. But he did.
Whenever Michael Reader wanted to work out where Marion was, he would send a text or call the number that was effectively on this tracker, and he'd be sent a location, and he could then map out where she was at what time of day.
I mean, when you find out someone's been tracking your mum, it's just another level of disgust. Like, you just can't believe or understand why someone would want to do that. Just sickening, absolutely sickening that he'd been stalking my mum for so long, and just devastated, absolutely heartbroken that my mum was even involved in a situation like this. Like, it shouldn't have happened.
Police still need to establish what Welch's involvement might have been. And analysing the tracker and the GPS phone data of both men proves enlightening. Every 5 to 7 days, the tracker sent a text message to Michael Reader's phone, telling him the battery was low.
And we could prove that mostly Welch's car was going from Northampton to Earls Barton very regularly.
There was a perfectly sensible inference to be drawn that these various trips between Northampton and Earls Barton were for the sole purpose of charging the tracker.
In custody, police questioned Reader about their findings.
Reader didn't give away much. He predominantly answered no comment and just made it clear that he didn't kill his wife, and then refused to answer questions. He made us do all the work.
I suspect he thought that simply getting rid of the handset would be enough to get rid of the evidence trail that ultimately led to him. He was very wrong about that, and he completely failed to understand that all the police needed was, in fact, to access the data, and you don't always need the handset itself in order to do that.
Police might believe that Michael was tracking Marion for a year, but that didn't prove he had fired the gun which killed her. A gun which they still hadn't found.
Any case, such as this, where somebody is killed with either a knife or a gun, the first thing that you will want is the murder weapon. And the first thing you will want to tell a jury about is the murder weapon and whether there are fingerprints or DNA on it. We had no such thing.
It's like a bit of a needle in a haystack. We knew we were after a shotgun, but we couldn't tell how long the barrel was. We didn't know what we were looking for, other than it was a shotgun of some type.
So in most murder cases, you'd imagine that somebody might find a weapon, somebody might find bullets, and police put huge resources into that. They used big manpower. They searched the River Nen. They searched houses. They searched areas where they knew that Reader and Welch had been to, but they were never able to find it.
Despite having found no weapon, police do receive some interesting information.
There was a witness who had seen a man on a motorbike at a point that was looking up to where we knew Marion was visiting her mother for some 50 minutes.
We had an eyewitness that said there's a bloke there on a motorbike, and I saw him and he was sat there for half an hour playing on his phone.
Who was this man? Was it Michael Reader? Or Stephen Welch? Police believe whoever it was removed the tracker from Marion's car while she was visiting her mother, then followed her back to her own home on the motorbike.
He sat there on his motorbike waiting for her. He followed her back to the house and he shot her in cold blood through the window before she'd even had a chance to take her seatbelt off.
Convinced Marion's ex-husband was involved in some capacity, police charge Michael Reader with her murder. But their second suspect, Stephen Welch, is still in Spain, although it appears he is keeping a close eye on events back in the UK.
The police could see from Stephen Welch's phone he had been Googling as to what had happened.
And on 20th of December 2019, Stephen Welch gets a big surprise.
So we had a reception committee waiting for him as he came off the plane. And he came back and we arrested him.
Welsh admitted he'd been ferrying the tracker backwards and forwards, and he admitted in evidence, I was complicit with a long-term stalking operation. I'm disgusted and ashamed of myself and everything.
News is made public that there is now not one, but two men charged with the murder of Marion Price.
It's just scary to think about how planned it was and the potential for it to be thought through enough for two people to be involved, and that someone else might know about it and haven't been able to have intervened and not. It's just scary, I suppose, to think about.
We were shocked when we found out that there was a second person involved, really shocked. We were just like, it's crazy enough that one person would want to do it, let alone an accomplice who has no reason towards my mum.
But with both men denying their involvement, police have their work cut out to build a case for trial.
Seeing Reader in court for the first time, I remember my heart racing, just pounding. I just felt sick when he walked in the room, but I just didn't want to show any emotion at all.
As the trial begins at Northampton Crown Court, the prosecution needs to lay out its case as to who pulled the trigger. And it very quickly becomes clear that one man has an ace up his sleeve.
In the first few days of the trial, Stephen Welch and Michael Reader sat in the dock together. They had the occasional chat. They were best friends after all. But it soon became apparent that actually it started to dawn on Stephen Welch that Michael Reader had really landed him in it big time. Within a few days of the trial starting, an extra dock officer was placed between them in the dock.
Stephen Welch had known that Reader had his ex-wife under surveillance. He did admit that he was playing a role in that. But at no time did Stephen Welch accept that he'd known what was about to happen or what had happened.
As the trial unfolds, stories emerge revealing the truth behind Marion Price and Reader's relationship.
Listening to the court case, there was a lot of things that came out that we didn't know. That was upsetting and shocking. He'd hit her a couple of times and that he'd threatened to kill her a few times.
Marion initially dismissed her children's concerns that something was wrong. But as the years passed, things went from bad to worse.
She never told me or my brother the full story. Mum and Mike were due to come over my house for Christmas dinner, and for some reason he didn't come over. And then when she'd gone home, he'd taken all the Christmas decorations down.
I had got some tickets for my mum for Jersey Boys. At the end of the musical, the whole audience gets up to dance, and my mum loves to dance, loves to sing, and he didn't like it. So he stormed out of the auditorium, left her in London. He'd just gone back to Northampton on the train.
In 2017, Marion left Michael Reader. Unbeknown to her children, she continued to give Reader £54,000 when he demanded money, until she put her foot down and refused in May 2017. Something which sparked a violent rage in Reader.
So he come round and he threatened her, and she said, I haven't got it, you can't have it. He said, well then you're going to have to sell your house. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And with that, he's pulled out a mallet of some type and hit her over the head several times.
Marion was taken to hospital, where she had stitches for a head wound and treatment for a broken finger. Rita was arrested and charged with grievous bodily harm.
It went to court, went to trial, and apparently, you know, the jury come to the conclusion that he hadn't done it. They went with him instead of my mum. And I feel like she was failed then. Sorry.
He managed to convince a jury on the first occasion that went in front of a court that it was an accident, that he'd tried to push her away and she banged her head on a doorpost, and that's how she broke her head and fingers. He'd managed to convince people that he hadn't done something, and he got away with it.
But having been cleared of attacking Marion in the past, he now stands accused of her murder.
Rita, on day one in court, day one of him giving evidence, he walked in and he thought he'd charmed the jury into believing his side of the story, that somebody else did it, it was nothing to do with him.
He was so confident that he could get away with it that he thought he'd planned the perfect murder.
Having convinced a jury of his innocence once before, could Michael Reader once again walk away an innocent man? At Northampton Crown Court, Michael Reader and his best friend Stephen Welch are standing trial for the murder of Reader's ex-wife, Marion Price.
We never found the motorbike. We never found the firearm. They planned this really well.
From the outset, my concern was that Reader had not only planned to kill his wife, and he planned to get away with it, but he'd planned a fall guy by using Stephen Welch as that fall guy.
The court hears how in November 2018, Michael Reader bought a tracking device and burner phone in order to start keeping tabs on Marion, something which the prosecution believe turned into a bigger plan.
What started off as stalking her to understand who she was with and where she was and whether she had a boyfriend and what she was doing with her money to help him with his divorce turned into the ideal method of tracking her so that he could kill her eventually.
And after being ordered to pay Marion £10,000 in a divorce settlement, Reader snapped.
When she came in and told me about it, and she was, you know, upbeat, she was pleased that it had all gone through and it was done. But there was just a niggle, there was just something that made me think that it wasn't all over.
Reader was full of hate. He couldn't get his head around why Marion would leave him. He couldn't live with the fact that she'd left him, walked away, carried on with her life, had a family that loved her. He wanted to take that away from her. It was just jealousy, it was coercive control, and it was just him trying to have the final say on what happened with her life.
The court hears how on 15th of December 2019, Marion visited her sister to get her hair done before going shopping. She then drove her silver Corsa back to Earls Barton to her mother's house, where she unloaded shopping between 4:15 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. It is here the prosecution claims the tracker was removed from her car. Marion was followed home and shot dead through her window, before she'd even taken off her seatbelt. But who actually pulled the trigger?
Reader's defence was he had nothing to do with the murder. He accepted he was sort of directing what he referred to as a surveillance operation on his ex-wife, using Stephen to do that. What he didn't accept was ever travelling to Earls Barton himself. And his insinuation was that whilst they both knew there was a surveillance operation going on, it would have been Stephen Welch that took it one step further, outside Reader's knowledge.
But the prosecution argues differently.
We believed, knowing all that we did, that Michael Reader would have wanted his ex-wife to see that it was him who was about to shoot her.
and they present the evidence they believe proves it.
This is where the Google data, the GPS data, came into play, was in relation to Stephen Welsh, because that showed not only had he waited patiently at Michael Reeder's home address whilst Michael Reeder's phone went off to Earls Barton and was located in the car park behind Marion's flat at the time that she was shot, but also, as soon as that was done, we saw Stephen Welsh's phone move from his address to meet the phone of Michael Reeder in what turned out to be a garage slightly north of where Marion was living.
The jury is told that after executing Marion in cold blood, Reeder once again turned to his trusted friend Stephen Welch, calling him to meet him at a nearby garage to dispose of the evidence.
He said that Michael Reeder gave him his coat and asked him to get rid of it. He drove up to a reservoir in order to get rid of it.
There was evidence that demonstrated that Welsh had travelled up to something called, I think it's Pittsford Lakes, and then down to the River Nene in the hour or so after the shooting in order to dispose of paraphernalia connected with the murder.
Stephen Welch tried to say that he was simply a man doing a friend a favour. He said he had no idea what had happened, yet he had been asked to dispose of clothes without asking any questions. He'd been asked to meet Michael Reeder at quite a rural location without asking any questions. He flew to Alicante the next morning. He saw stories online about Marion's death, and he asked no questions. Who does that?
The court hears that following this discovery, police searched the river.
We found a bag with some clothing, a rucksack that had been thrown into the river there, that became quite crucial at trial.
And despite Reeder's insistence otherwise, the prosecution is adamant he was the one who pulled the trigger.
Whereas the prosecution case against Reeder was, he was the shooter. The case against Welsh was, he was not the shooter. He was involved in what we call a joint enterprise. In other words, he was actively involved in the planning and assisting of the murder.
Having both denied their part in the murder, on 30th of November 2020, the jury retires to consider its verdict. Would Michael Reeder once again walk away a free man?
Once the jury went out to deliberate on their verdicts, we really were as confident as we could be, even though it can always go wrong with a jury. And I have done a number of cases over the years in which a jury has come back with a verdict that was not expected.
After 3 days of deliberating, the jury returns its verdict. Stephen Welch is found guilty of murder. Michael Reeder is found guilty of murder.
So we sat there in the court and they said guilty, and I just looked down and just started crying. Relief, you know, we've got justice for my mum.
You don't feel like there's anything to celebrate when the verdict comes in. It's very sad all round. You know, we've lost our mum. Their families have lost someone in their family to prison, and it's just there's just no one wins in that situation. No one comes out any the better.
On 21st of December 2020, just over a year after the brutal murder, Michael Reeder is sentenced to life, with a minimum term of 31 years. Stephen Welch is jailed for a minimum of 27 years.
We were pleased with the sentencing, and the judge's sentencing remarks were great. She knew what they'd done. She sentenced them accordingly. It sends a message that this behaviour, that in this county you're not going to get away with that sort of thing. I'm sure that will be something the family will take heart in. Not from a vindictive point of view, from a point of view that he won't do anyone else any harm.
I think that Michael Reeder was motivated by loss of control. He lost control of Marion. she had the audacity to leave him.
Despite the sentences, the pain of losing their mum is something Marion's family will live with forever.
The way I feel now is a bit empty, lost, but, you know, we're getting there. Living life for her. Just, we're not going to let it break us, or, you know, we're going to be happy, and I still sing around the kitchen and clean. Not as much as she cleans, but, you know, I'm trying. And we're getting together and we're making memories with the boys, and we just talk about her all the time.
When I think about my mum and our memories, they're always happy memories. They're always filled with a lot of laughter, a lot of fun, just having a good time. My memories are of very happy times, and that's something that can't be taken away.
The team lurched from one crisis to another with an enemy that is impossible to predict. Cobra Cyber War is new Thursday at 9 on Sky Mix.
Found my wife cheating on me last night. I met my wife in 2011. I was DJing a social event at school and playing some 90s rocks. I was playing Third Eye Blind, and my wife liked the song that came on. She talked to me. We bonded over our mutual love of the band, yada yada. We started dating. Fast forward to 2013, we got engaged and we took a trip, and to celebrate, we have this memory we talk about a lot of listening to the whole Third Eye Blind catalog and singing along to all the songs together. We got married that year. Fast forward through our whole marriage, we had this thing where we would try to see the band as much as we could. We saw them whenever they were on tour, a total of 9 times during our 9 years of marriage. Last night, we were supposed to see them for the 10th time. If you're the math in your head, we've been married for 10 years as well. That's coming up in November, so I had this whole thing planned where we would go see the show, stay over at a hotel, have a romantic night. I get home from work on Friday, my wife is getting ready, she looks amazing. I see a text come on her phone. You know how the rest of the story goes, I don't even want to type it. She met some guy the night before when I was away for work. The part that killed me the most was she wrote that he needed to get condoms and he's LOL. So I'm left wondering, did they even use any? What does it matter anymore anyway? After reading that, I just left the house and started for the concert. She calls me about 15 minutes later like, "Where are you?" "Oh, you know, just on the way to the show." "What? Why?" You know why. Think long and hard as to why I might be acting this way. I just hang up. Anyway, I think I was in shock still. I was pretty cool about it. But there's some backstory there I don't want to get into as to why I was prepared. She's cheated twice before in the past. I didn't really have any emotions at the time. Actually, when I started typing, this was the first time I felt anything. So she calls back and starts going through the motions. "Oh, we are just friends." "Oh, we didn't actually do it." "Oh, I was drunk." "Oh, it was just in a little bit." Then it was all, "Come back and let's talk about this like adults," as if I'm the childish one for having stormed out. I'm thinking, no. If that happens, I'm not seeing this show. We're just going to talk about how she cheated and she's going to try and seduce me. And that thought grossed me out. I never thought about sex with my wife and felt gross, but then I did. So I got to the concert and the guy scanned my ticket. He looks at me and says, "There's 2," indicating that he wanted to scan the other one. I just stared at him blankly and said, "Yes, there's 2," and went inside. I was so weird I felt like I was hypnotized. And then there was the show. Amazing show. I had a good time. I met some nice people in my row, and we had a fun time enjoying the concert together. Some lyric hit a little differently. I've never been so alone, and I've never felt more alive. I felt pretty alive at the concert. I danced with the crowd and screamed my frustrations into the loudspeakers. No one could hear me over the loud rock music. It was over pretty early. I wanted to sit at the bar and drink, but that would have required talking to someone, and I just couldn't outside of the context of the concert. I was thinking about the texts again, so I went to the hotel I had booked for my wife and I, and went to sleep alone. I woke up to about 30 emails. She was up all night feeling all kinds of emotions, I guess. Guilt, shame, anger at me. Those were the most surreal. The ones where she was mad at me for going through her phone. A lot of bargaining and pleading. The worst was she had sent me cards I had written for her years before. Anniversary cards, birthday cards, Christmas cards. I always hand-wrote a letter for her, professing my love for her. I never used to write anyone cards like these, but I did for her. She used to write cards like these for me. She hasn't in a number of years. I think her intent was that upon reading the cards, my heart would soften and I would realize how much I loved her. I would come to my senses and come to her, and we would talk it through, and I would forgive her, and it would all be better. But instead, it just made me realize how much she doesn't love me. At this point, I can't forgive her. I forgave her once, and here we are. If I forgive her again, it's just a matter of when. The only question now is whether I respect myself to make sure this never happens to me again.